Section 21 of Bonnie May by Lewis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. An exit and an entrance. It was rather a pity that Bonnie May yielded to an impulse to go out and have a little talk with Mrs. Shepherd after she had finished her dinner. It was a pity because she also yielded to an impulse to talk confidentially to the sympathetic old servant, and as a result she received an entirely erroneous impression. "I'm going away for a visit," said Bonnie May by way of opening. "A visit," repeated Mrs. Shepherd. "Why, ain't you here just for a visit?" "Oh, yes, of course," was the response, given rather blankly. "You mean you're going for a visit somewhere else?" "Yes, that's what I mean." There was silence for a time, while Bonnie May tried to realize the full truth of what Mrs. Shepherd had said. Yes, she was merely a visitor in the mansion, certainly, and they had probably been regarding her in that light all the time. A fear she had entertained earlier in the day recurred to her. "And I expect they may be getting tired of me," she threw out tentatively. Mrs. Shepherd was what is usually called a sensible woman. "Oh, well," she replied, "you know how that is. When you are a visitor, people always treat you politely, but, of course, they expect you not to wear your welcome out." "Of course," assented Bonnie May. She didn't permit Mrs. Shepherd to see that she had suddenly grown horribly uncomfortable. "You know, when people see too much of each other, they get tired of each other," added the sensible servant. "The most natural thing in the world," agreed Bonnie May. She felt that she suddenly hated Mrs. Shepherd with a dreadful hatred. She did not at all realize that Mrs. Shepherd was innocently laying down a general proposition which she had no thought of applying to anyone in particular. Still, she meant to behave graciously. "If I should ever come back again, you won't mind if I come out and bake a little cake once in a while?" she asked. She was achieving her most friendly smile. Mrs. Shepherd turned toward her with energy. "I certainly won't," she declared. There were no general propositions in her mind now. She was saying to herself, "Was there ever such a cunning little thing? And I do hope you'll come back soon," she added. Bonnie May nodded brightly and entered the dining room. She paused to adjust an article or two on the table. She tried to assume the manner of one who is quite light-hearted. She was preparing herself to play her part properly when she joined the family upstairs. They were all assembled in the sitting room, and each was silent and self-centered when Baron dropped the evening paper to the floor and addressed Bonnie May when she entered the room in the manner of one who has forgotten something. "You're not ready to go with me to the Thornburgs," he said. "You know we ought to be starting before long." The effect of this casual utterance was quite electrifying. The elder Baron dropped his paper also and removed his glasses. Flora, searching through a box of letters with some more or less definite end in view, permitted several envelopes with their contents to slip to the floor. She turned a gaze of marked disfavor upon her brother. Mrs. Baron merely swallowed with difficulty and looked decidedly uncomfortable. Bonnie May felt the tension in the atmosphere. They were trying to be nice and polite about it, she decided. "I only have to put my hat on," she said. She succeeded wholly in creating the impression that she was delighted with their planning as usual. Mrs. Barron arose with a little tremor in her limbs. Her attitude became that of one who is tenderly maternal and pathetically old. She bent over and took the child's hands in hers. "My dear," she said, "are you quite sure you are willing to go?" Bonnie May looked into her eyes and smiled. She was grateful for this proof of kindness. They were the nicest people, truly. They weren't going to permit her to feel offended. "Oh, yes," she said brightly. Mrs. Barron released her hands and turned away. "I think it will be very nice to go," added Bonnie May. "You know, when people see too much of one another, they get tired of one another." "I dare say," responded Mrs. Barron. She was determined the ungrateful little thing shouldn't see how wounded she was. "Well, if you're to go to the Thornburgs, I ought to see that you are presentable." She and the child disappeared, Mrs. Barron leading the way and Bonnie May looking back over her shoulder with a smile. "Extraordinary," said the elder Baron. "She's certainly a puzzle to me," said Barron. "Maybe the Thornburgs can do better with her." "Oh, don't judge her just by that one tactless speech," exclaimed Flora. "Don't forget what a little thing she is." Then silence fell in the room, and the typical barren existence was maintained until the mistress of the house returned, guiding Bonnie May serenely before her. Bonnie May in her best dress and in a saucy straw hat decorated with silk pansies and with a ridiculous little hand satchel depending from her hooked forefinger. "All right," said Barron, leading the way toward the stairs. He had an idea that words had better be used sparingly. But at the door, the departing guest turned for a last look, and instead of the masks of affable politeness she expected to behold, there was instead a look of unmistakable regret on every face. Regret which amounted to actual grief, so far as Mrs. Barron and Flora were concerned. Surely they weren't glad to see her go. There must be a mistake. She clasped her hands and leaned forward in an attitude of great earnestness. "You know how I love you," she cried. Her voice almost failed her. Mrs. Barron came forward, all her resentment gone. "Indeed we do," she declared. "There, you're not going away feeling badly. I'm very sorry you feel that you ought to go, and we'll be very anxious to have you come back as soon as you possibly can." "Oh, thank you so much." She lifted impulsive arms to Mrs. Barron's neck and hugged her. She looked back at the others, and they could see that there was happiness in her eyes as well as tears. Then she was gone in Barron's wake. The sound of her voice, anxiously questioning, drifted up the stairs until it was suddenly quieted by the closing of the front door. "I'm afraid we'll have to go out on a streetcar," said Barron. "When you want to come back, the Thornburgs will probably send you in an automobile." She clasped her hands. "Fine," said she. Barron frowned, a fact which she remarked. "I wasn't thinking about the automobile," she hastened to assure him. "Why the unconcealed rapture, then?" "Oh, I thought you might be starting out to lose me, as you would a cat or a dog, you know. I'm glad there'll be a way for me to get back." Barron refused to see any humor in her remark. "I wish you'd quit looking at it like that," he said. "Someday you'll understand better why I think it is a good thing for you to be friendly with the Thornburgs. Just now you may rest assured that we're going to miss you." He realized that he was being rather serious, and he tried to end his observations more cheerfully. "And whenever it pleases you to honor us with your presence again, you'll find the latch string, etc., etc." There was a very pleasant old garden at the rear of the Thornburg residence, a fairly roomy region of old trees and vines and rustic seats and dreams. In the midst of this sylvan scene stood a very old, friendly apple tree, and beneath this, in the evening dusk through which Baron and Bonnie May were escorted out into the garden, sat Mrs. Thornburg. Thornburg had received them, and it was his idea that it would be a fine thing for the two guests to take Mrs. Thornburg unawares. She regarded the visitors rather wearily at first as they emerged from the shadows and stood before her. Then she recognized Baron, and her face brightened wonderfully. There was a child with him, and of course it would be the child. She arose from her many-cushioned seat and leaned a little forward, while Bonnie May regarded her with earnest eyes. "You see, we're here," said Baron, trying to strike a light and cheerful note. Mrs. Thornburg scarcely seemed to notice him. "Yes," she said dreamily. She did not remove her eyes from Bonnie May's. It was the child who completed her scrutiny first. She glanced about her appraisingly. "A very beautiful exterior you have here," she remarked somewhat loftily. Mrs. Thornburg smiled rapturously at this. A warm hue stole into her cheeks. "I'm glad you like it," she said. She glanced at Baron now with joyous wonder in her eyes. "We think it's pretty," she added. "It might make you think of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, mightn't it?" It was plain that she was feeling her way cautiously. "We might imagine we were the children who played under the juniper tree, though I'm not sure an apple tree would pass for a juniper tree." Bonnie May nodded amiably. "Or it might remind you of a Shakespeare setting," she suggested. The woman regarded her anew with a look of wonder and pique and delight, and then it was evident that she had reached the limits of her restraint. With hands that trembled, she drew the child slowly toward her, until she had the radiant face pressed against her breast. "Dear child, do try to love me, won't you?" she pleaded, and Baron saw that her face twitched and that her eyes were offering a prayer to the soft sky in which the first stars of evening were just blossoming. Then, almost stealthily, he left them. Baggot was waiting for him in front of the house when he reached home. To be exact, the young playwright was sitting on the front step, nervously puffing a cigarette. "What took you out this time in the evening?" he demanded. "I've been taking Bonnie May for a visit." "Oh, her. I wanted to ask you, who is she?" Baron was unlocking the door. "Her name is Bonnie May," he said. "Oh, I know that. I mean, who is she? A grandchild or something?" "I haven't any grandchildren. Suppose we go into the house." "I don't see why I shouldn't know who she is. It seems a pity to me that you can't say something." Baggot threw his cigarette into the street and followed Baron into the house and up into the attic. Arrived there, he renewed his attack. "While it seems improbable that you can add anything to the very explicit account you have given me of Bonnie May, I'd like to say that I'm curious to know who she is." Baron turned upon him quietly. "In view of your unchallengeable right to ask questions about a guest who happens to be in this house, I will explain that she is an actress by profession, and that being out of an engagement just now, she is accepting our hospitality." Baggot was undisturbed. He exclaimed, "Well, I thought—" "You thought?" "That I recognized her. Her ways, I mean. You could tell there was something about her." "Well," concluded Baron, "now let's see what's up." He had turned on the light, and now he shoved a chair in Baggot's direction. "What do you think of the play?" demanded Baggot. I haven't read it yet." Baggot laughed lamely, and his whole bearing expressed contempt. "You don't seem to be at all excited about it," he complained. Baron made no response to that. He was wondering where Baggot got his enthusiasm for things. "Well, the point is," continued the other, "I've got a producer, and it's to be put on right away over at the palace. They've got a summer stock company, you know. They're going to give it a trial performance." Baron was surprised. "I congratulate you," he said. "I suppose such things were pretty hard to manage." Baggot explained with complete frankness. "I know that. You see, I've got an uncle who is financially interested in the palace. He's got confidence in me, in this play anyway. He made them give me a trial, and that's all I ask for. It will go like wildfire. You'll see." He had lighted another cigarette and was puffing nervously. "Where is it?" he demanded. And when the manuscript was placed in his hands, he drew nearer to the light. With smoke curling up into his eyes, he began to read aloud. He held his head askew to escape the smoke. Baron leaned back, his face in shadow, and curiously studied the intense manner of his companion. Baggot read, fitfully, speedily, with an occasional aside, which he dropped entirely when he got well into the action of the drama. There was something of impersonation in his manner as he read now one character's line and now another's. He put so much interest into the reading that it seemed almost like acting. And presently, Baron began to see vivid pictures. He was carried into a strange, pleasant atmosphere. He was delighted by quaint, unexpected bits of dialogue. He perceived, little by little, the trend of the whimsical philosophy. He could scarcely believe that this was Baggot's work. He forgot to take account of time, and when the last act was finished, he found that he had risen to his feet. "Splendid!" he exclaimed. "Splendid!" Baggot thrust the manuscript from him and turned to the other with brilliant, triumphant eyes. "No fault to find with that," he challenged. In another moment he had left the room and was hurrying down the stairs and away from the house, too excited to contain himself. The manuscript remained where it had fallen. Late the next afternoon, Baron returned from a day's work in the Times office. He was thinking of Baggot's play. He meant to read it for himself, to see how much he had been influenced the day before by Baggot's almost hypnotic enthusiasm. He went up into the attic room, and there, much to his amazement and delight, he was confronted by Bonnie May. She blushed with confusion and looked at him almost guiltily. "Back so soon!" he exclaimed. "Why, it seemed to me I was away quite a long time." "Well, yes, I suppose I've been rather busy." He looked about for the manuscript, which seemed to have been removed. "Did you find it pleasant at the Thornburgs?" he asked. He was succeeding now in getting back to his habitual quiet manner. "Oh, yes, quite pleasant." "That's nice. I somehow imagined they might persuade you to stay a little longer." "No. When I said I ought to be coming home, she sent to the garage and had the automobile brought around for me." Baron nodded. "And she wasn't disappointed then?" "She was very nice about it. She asked me to come again. She told the man that any time I telephoned to him, he might come with the machine and get me, here, you know, any afternoon. It seems Mr. Thornburg never uses the machine in the afternoons, and she doesn't care for it herself. She was just as nice as she could be, and of course I'm going back. But you know I really belong here." "Yes, certainly," assented Baron. "Yes, I understand that." He was still a bit puzzled. He added tentatively, Wasn't everything beautiful there? Beautiful? In what way? The house, the grounds, everything. Oh, the settings. Yes, they were quite pretentious. But they never count for so much, really. It is the action and the dialogue that really count. And I like the action and the dialogue here much better. End of section 21. Section 22 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. Baggot's Play. When you are told that you have only to telephone to a certain garage and a very fine, large automobile will be sent around to your house entirely at your service, a very strong temptation has been placed in your way. Bonnie May could scarcely believe that she could achieve so much by a mere word or two over the telephone, and it was not at all surprising that she experimented within a day or two after her first visit to the Thornburg home. The automobile came with almost incredible promptness, and a chauffeur who had the gallant bearing of a soldier did everything but fling a cloak on the ground for Bonnie May to walk on. She called rather briefly and formally on Mrs. Thornburg on this occasion, but the experience had its special, delighting excitements. The experiment was repeated frequently, and the truth must be recorded that before long Bonnie May was spending her time more or less equally between the mansion and the Thornburg home. She became something of a personage during those days. Baggot called on Baron one afternoon, and upon being informed that Baron was out, he asked for Bonnie May and spent fully an hour with her, leaving her in a high state of complacency. The next day he called again, and this time he did not ask for Baron. He came, he said, to call on Bonnie May. But this time she was not in. She spent a good part of her time as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Thornburg, Baggot was told, which indicates clearly enough how the status of affairs had changed. Baggot made a note of this information and went away in a thoughtful mood. The members of the Baron family considered these developments without commenting upon them very much at first. But one day Baron Sr. took occasion to express an opinion. It seems strange to have a mere infant passing between two houses like a bird between two trees, he said. This was thought to be his mild way of expressing disapproval. "It's Victor's arrangement," replied Mrs. Baron. This response was made less inadequate by the way her eyebrows went up. "The fact is," declared Flora, "we've all fallen in love with the saucy little thing." "Well?" inquired Mrs. Baron truculently. "I mean, I don't think Victor's idea is a bad one at all. She's, well, the kind that do extraordinary things when they grow up. We may be glad enough to be in a position where we can get from under one of these days." "I'm thinking of our responsibility," was her mother's rejoinder. "Yes, so am I. Suppose she made up her mind to be an actress again. The Thornburgs would be just the right kind of friends for her if she did. And Victor says they are very good people. But having an actress in the house, in our house, would be like having a cub bear for a pet. They're cunning enough when they're little, but there comes a time when you have to telephone the zoo or turn in a riot call." "You ought to be ashamed," cried Mrs. Baron. I'm sure she's a good child, a very good child." The word reconstruction came to Flora's mind, but she didn't say anything about it. She only smiled rather tantalizingly and added, "Just the same, I believe in cyclone cellars." So it became no uncommon thing for a huge car to stop before the mansion. "For me," Bonnie May would exclaim on these occasions, whereupon she would hurry into jacket and hat and eagerly clasp Mrs. Barron and Flora about the neck and hurry with real childish eagerness as far as the front door, after which she would demurely cross the sidewalk and take her place in the car with the air of any sedate lady of fashion. The first little unpleasantness between Bonnie May and Barron arose very soon after this series of irregular exits and entrances began. "While I think of it," said Barron casually, addressing the child, "I want to provide a fund for you." He smiled amiably. "See?" He took a quantity of change from his pocket and placed it in a vase. "Whenever you go calling, it will be proper for you to put something in your purse, for tips, perhaps, or for something of that kind. I am sure a young lady ought to have a little money." Bonnie May looked curiously into his smiling face, which seemed to have been transformed for the moment into a mask. "I don't believe I would bother about that," she replied. "I'm not bothering." Barron's smile stiffened slightly. "I merely wish you to have what you want." "But Mrs. Thornburg always gives me money." The smile vanished. "That's very good of Mrs. Thornburg, certainly. But when you are in our house, you won't need her money. When you're starting out from this end of the route, you'll find money in the vase." She looked at him intently, not quite understanding the unfriendly note in his voice. "I believe you are jealous," she said. "You see too much," rejoined Barron resentfully. "It isn't that. You show too much." "Of course, I ought to be grateful for criticism from such a source." She regarded him with wonder, her eyes filling with tears. "You've no right to speak to me like that. You know I don't need any money. You have all been so generous, and it's only because Mrs. Thornburg isn't well, and because I don't know her as well as I know you, that I took money from her. She was so happy giving it to me. It would have been rude for me to refuse, but here I've been with friends." She brushed the tears from her eyes and ran from the room. As in other times of stress, Mrs. Shepherd in the kitchen became her refuge. Barron looked after her with an assumption of idle curiosity, but when he heard a distant door close, his expression changed to real concern. He was dismayed when he thought how deeply he had wounded the child. He was aware of a sudden resentment against the Thornburgs. He sat down and gazed abstractedly at the carpet. He realized after a time that he was studying the meaningless outlines of a figure in faded colors. "We need a new carpet," he mused. "We need everything new. And the only new thing we've got hold of in years is discovering that everything in the house, including ourselves, is threadbare and respectable and ugly." Then he realized that Bonnie May had come back into the room and that she was almost impatiently trying to thrust her hand into his. "Oh, do let's play nice parts," she remonstrated. "You know, if you once start in melodrama, it's the hardest thing in the world to get into anything better." He leaned back and clasped his hands behind his head. I think I make rather a silly villain, he admitted. You see, I know what troubled you. I thought it out. You thought I could care more for the things the Thornburgs do for me than I do for the lovely way you took me in here and were good to me. Wasn't that it? Why, something like that. Well, that's silly. Politeness. That's all it's been with them. But the way you took me in and treated me and everything. You don't think I could be such a little beast as not to understand all that, do you? There was no other friction for many days. Indeed, Bonnie May was less frequently absent when Baron came into the house from his journeys about the city. She seemed, after all, to be developing only a limited interest in the Thornburgs. Besides, Baron had a new interest thrust upon him. Baggot had arrived at a point in the development of his play which made him an incessant nuisance to all his acquaintances, and to Baron most of all. He could talk of nothing but his drama. The Break of Day, it was called, and he insisted upon consulting Baron or inviting his admiration and approval half a dozen times a day. Rehearsals had begun over at the palace, and the process of cutting and elaborating and altering was almost driving Baggot mad with resentment sometimes, or mad with excitement and anticipations. You'll review it for one of the papers, won't you? He demanded of Baron on one occasion, indicating by manner and tone that a refusal was out of the question. How can I tell? Retorted Baron. I'll have to wait until I'm asked. I'll attend to that. He was blind to Baron's contemptuous and skeptical grin. And I'll want to extend courtesies to your family if you don't mind. A box. You know it helps a lot to have the right kind of people at a premiere. He perceived something in Baron's eyes which disquieted him. I mean, he added, I want to get the opinion of the right kind of people. Thank you, said Baron. Of course I can't answer for the family. They might like to come. They will appreciate the invitation in any event. He was wondering why he had ever permitted Baggot to get acquainted with him. Then, afraid that Baggot would read his thought in his eyes, he added evasively, Bonnie May appears to be the real theater-goer of the family. She will want to come, I'm sure. Oh, Bonnie May! Baggot seemed to be brushing the name aside. It's the family I want. I have a reason. Be sure not to fail me. He seemed to remember something in connection with the work over at the palace. In a moment he was gone, without a word of farewell. He was utterly childish, Baron thought, and certainly it was wrong to disappoint children needlessly. Yes, he would really try to persuade the family to go. When occasion arose to speak to Bonnie May alone, he tried to make light of the whole affair. A great honor, he began, for you and all of us. A box has been reserved for us for the first performance of the Break of Day. Bonnie May clapped her hands. How fine, she said. Do you think they will all go? I hardly know. Really, it doesn't seem very important, does it? A first performance in a summer theater by an unknown company. She seemed anxious. Anyway, I do hope Mother will go. Baron thought he understood that. If Mother refused to go, she might not be permitted to go herself. However, he approached his mother on the subject with a certain amount of earnestness. I've had a sort of hand in the play, in a small way, he explained, and Baggot is anxious to have us all come. He couldn't resist the temptation to add, he places a high value on the opinion of what he calls nice people. That means us. You can't seem indifferent to such recognition, can you?" Mrs. Barron was deaf to the sarcasm. "Isn't it one of those cheap summer theaters?" she asked. "Yes, but really I don't know that it will be very different from the winter performances, not as an ethical proposition anyway." "I hardly think I'd be interested," she decided. However, she did not speak with her usual certainty, and she glanced at her son a bit anxiously, if he really wanted her to go. On a later occasion, Barron again touched the subject. He had just got rid of Baggot, who was in an unusually enthusiastic mood. "Really, Mother, I have an idea that play is going to be quite worthwhile, if you didn't mind it very much." But Mrs. Barron fancied she was being coerced. "No, I think not," she said, shaking her head. "And Bonnie May," added Barron. "Great goodness, how anxious she is to go. I suppose she thinks she can't go unless you do." Mrs. Barron's eyes flashed. That was it. Bonnie May's comfort and pleasure. That and nothing more. "I remember that argument," she said rather disagreeably. "You forget that she has other friends now, rather better suited to her needs in this case. The Thornburgs can take her." But Barron, noting the uncomfortable look in her eyes, left her with the conclusion unexpressed. "My bet is that the Thornburgs will not take her." End of section 22. Section 23 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. Barron comes home on a Beer-Dray. Barron was not at all confident that any of the dramatic editors would want him to write a review of The Break of Day. He merely hoped his services might be required, and he was disappointed. He might have had the assignment for the asking, perhaps, but he felt a hesitancy about asking. He had fathered the play somewhat. He had a personal interest in it. Moreover, there was one reason why he was glad to be disengaged. Now he could attend the performance as an ordinary spectator, and he could take Bonnie May with him. The day of the first performance arrived. Barron left the mansion early in the forenoon, more for the purpose of escaping the half-insane Baggot than for any other reason. Baggot didn't really believe that Barron could help him, perhaps, but his nature demanded that he talk about his play all the time, and Barron listened well. Bonnie May was not about when Barron left the mansion. He had had no final understanding with her as to whether she was to go to the theater that night or not. And it was for this reason that he was coming home in a particularly eager mood late in the afternoon to tell her that he was footloose and that she might depend upon him as an escort to the theater. He was coming home with much eagerness, and then an accident happened. He started to alight from the crosstown car before it stopped, and his foot struck a loose fragment of stone, and he lost his balance. Thinking of the matter afterward, he decided that he could not recall an experience more banal, more needless. But he did not reach this conclusion at the time, for the good reason that his head struck the pavement and he lost consciousness. There had been just one instant of sharp agony. He opened his eyes presently to find himself supported by two men. Every passenger in the crowded car, which had stopped, was staring at him. A crowd of pedestrians had also stopped to see what had happened. He looked dazedly at the two men who were supporting him. One was the car conductor, whose eyes expressed fear and disgust. The other man's appearance was in some degree familiar to Baron. He was gigantic, ruddy, wholly self-possessed. Baron wondered who this man was, and then, as his gaze roved weakly from point to point, he saw a red Beer-Dray, and he knew. This was the beer driver whom he and Bonnie May had watched and discussed one day from the attic window. "He's all right," declared the beer driver, getting a firmer grip on Baron's arm. Baron was greatly relieved to hear that he was all right. He had his doubts. The back of his head seemed to be asleep, and there was a horrible pain in his left leg when he tried to touch the pavement with his foot. "I'll want your name and address and the names of witnesses," said the conductor. He had produced a little notebook. "You don't need them," declared Baron. "It was my own fault. I don't want to be detained here." "But the rules require," said the conductor. "Just forget the rules," advised the beer driver, who perceived that Baron meant what he said. And in an instant, Baron was feeling a new sort of embarrassment, because the ruddy giant of the Beer-Dray had picked him up in his arms and was taking long strides in the direction of his dray. "Out of the way," he ordered, and people obeyed. Baron had the helpless sensation of one who rides on an elephant. He thought he realized now just what it must be to perform the tasks of a mahout. "Though I don't seem to need an ankus yet," he meditated. Baron had read his Kipling. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he said, speaking in a general downward direction. "You're not troubling me," came back the answer. The driver had reached his dray, and greatly to Baron's amazement, he put a foot on the hub of the wheel, a disengaged hand on the iron bar surrounding the back of the seat, and had vaulted into a sitting posture, carrying his burden with him. It seemed to Baron that he had been swung through limitless space, as if he had been a star held to its place by gravity. He held his hat in place as he might have done if a cyclone had seized him in its clutch. And with such attention as he could command, he was observing the performance of the driver. "Sit down," commanded that individual. Needlessly, for already Baron was by his side, holding on to the iron bar at the back of the seat, and feeling uncomfortably light and dizzy. His companion looked into his eyes. "A pretty hard jolt," he said, thrusting a protecting arm about his charge. "Gee up!" Hold the reins dexterously with the aid of thumb and little finger, and the horses began to move. Much to Baron's surprise, the driver did not ask him where he lived, but quietly turned his horses' heads in the right direction, adjusting the brake with his foot, and glancing ahead to see that the right-of-way was clear. Baron's mind reverted to Bonnie May for an instant, and he remembered that she had noted how the driver had held his reins with authority and sat with his great legs planted purposefully before him. Yes, that was precisely right. "You haven't asked me where I live," he remarked, trying to be partly independent of his companion's support. "I don't have to. I know." "How?" "I've noticed you before now. You're one of the Barons." The injured man felt flattered. Still, he reflected, the driver might have noticed him for any number of unflattering reasons. For a moment he tried to fathom this thought. Was it an evidence that the driver was simple and stupid, that he had interested himself in the people who lived in his neighborhood? He couldn't reach a satisfactory conclusion. "It's awfully good of you to give me a lift like this," he remarked. He was beginning to feel a little less shaken and strange. "Oh, I don't know. You'd do as much for me, wouldn't you?" "Carry you around and lift you up on a high seat?" asked Barron incredulously. The driver threw back his immense head, revealing a bronzed, bull-like throat from which a sound like thunder came. "Well, no, I guess you wouldn't do that," he admitted. The horses, with their ears turned alternately toward the driver and pointed ahead, were brought to a halt in front of the mansion. "Now you sit up here and hold tight, and try to look as if nothing had happened," directed the driver. He removed his arm and sprang to the pavement. "Why?" Barron wanted to know. "I want to call your old lady out so she can see you sitting up on the seat." Barron frowned. "Why?" he asked again. "If I'd carry you to the door and ring the bell, she'd have a fit when she came out. She's pretty high-strung anyway." It was as if he were describing a woman of his own household instead of Barron's. "Oh," responded Barron. He was thinking that it was difficult to know where to expect chivalry in one form or another, and that there were various ways of manifesting it. "I believe you're right," he added. It was Mrs. Barron who came to the door in response to a ring. It is not improbable that she had been looking out of the upper window. "Your son wants to speak to you," said the driver, dragging off his German cap and revealing a shock of disheveled hair. Mrs. Barron seemed to ignore the man utterly. She stood, pale and rigid, staring at Barron. She comprehended at least one thing. He had driven up to the door of the mansion in a Beer-Dray. Then she smiled ominously. "What a quaint idea," said she, passing the driver and descending the steps. "Of course, this is one of your jokes." She paused then. She had swiftly become less assured in her anger. "I've had a mean fall, Mother," said Barron, trying to keep a martyr-like tone out of his voice. "I'm afraid I'll have to be carried into the house. This man was good enough to bring me home. He was afraid of alarming you. It was his idea that you ought to be notified before he carried me in." "Oh, I didn't understand." There was swift, childlike remorse in her bearing. "It was kind of you," she added to the driver by way of atonement for her rudeness. She regarded him with flickering eyes. She could not help shrinking from the warm, gross bulk of the man, yet she admired him somewhat as a lamb might admire a benevolent bull that has just driven a wolf away. She went as far as the curb and looked up at Barron critically. Yes, he was seriously injured. Something told her that. A strained expression about his lips and eyes, perhaps, and his attitude. She turned anxiously to the driver. "Do you suppose you can get him in without any help?" she asked. "Sure." The driver derived no joy from her sudden discomfiture. In the sudden leveling of her high spirit to the lowly plane of a fearful mother. Perhaps he did not realize that she had been wrathful toward her son and rude to him. "You go and push the door open and get things ready." He approached Barron and held his arms up. Barron put his hands on the immense fellow's shoulders, and again he experienced that sensation of being swung through space. In an instant, he was being borne up his own front steps. "Can you carry him upstairs?" inquired Mrs. Barron dubiously. "Why not?" And up the stairs the driver proceeded without the slightest evident effort. At the top, Mrs. Barron led the way into Barron's old room, now Bonnie Mae's. But the driver paused on the threshold, leisurely casting his eyes over the evidences of feminine proprietorship. You'd better let me take him to his own room, Mother, he declared decisively. He seemed quite unconscious of bearing a burden. He was woodenly indifferent to Baron's efforts to get down. But that's up another flight, was Mrs. Barron's faltering response. That's all right. You see, I'm used to delivering beer barrels, and they always find they save trouble if they let me put 'em just where they belong. Baron, thinking of the difficulties which might arise when this willing and capable Atlas was gone, quite agreed with the suggestion. I'm sure he's right, Mother, he said, if he doesn't mind. Up another flight, Baron was borne, and at the top the driver turned about haltingly, but still seemingly unaware of having his strength taxed, and called down, You'd better see about getting a doctor, Mother. He'll need to have himself looked after. I can put him to bed. Baron was able to grin weakly at the driver's simple generalship, and at the fact that his mother obeyed with nervous promptitude. That way, said he, pointing, and then he essayed a little joke. I think you forgot to carry me around the block a time or two before you started up here, didn't you? He asked the driver. Oh, it's nothing, came back the response. If I had a 12-year-old boy who didn't weigh more than you do, I'd drown him. With this, the attic room was entered, and Baron was placed carefully on a chair. Then his shoes and other garments were removed with caution, and before he quite realized what had happened, he was in bed. I wish I had your strength, he said, feeling that such service as he had received ought to be acknowledged somehow. What? Oh, you'd better leave that to me. I need it and you don't. I guess that's about the only thing I've got. No, it isn't. You've got the right kind of a heart, too. This created instant embarrassment. By way of escape from praise, the big fellow whispered loudly, Say the word and I'll jump out and get a bucket of beer before the mother gets back. Beer, exclaimed Baron. He had always associated beer with festive occasions, and he was quite sure the present moment was not a festive occasion. I don't believe I care for any beer just now. He believed he had achieved a commendably diplomatic stroke by adding the two last words. He was prompted to add, But if you're sure your horses won't get restless, I'd be glad to have you stay until Mother comes. The driver sat down, selecting a straight-backed chair and holding himself so upright that he made Baron think of a huge, benevolent heathen god. He had dropped his cap to the floor beside him, and his hands were clasped about his capacious stomach. There was now a restful placidity as well as extraordinary power in his presence. And it isn't just your strength that I envy, said Baron, catching the luminous blue eyes of the driver for an instant. It's the generous way you've got of treating a fellow as if he were a brother. This, too, created great embarrassment. The driver's face flamed, and he struggled to get away from anything resembling praise. Yes, sir, he exclaimed, as if he were merely continuing, That bay horse would stand in his tracks until I came back, even if the owner of the brewery tried to drive him away. Baron laughed. Well, I won't say anything more to your credit if you don't want to hear it, he said. But after a moment's silence, he went on, more seriously than he had yet spoken. But do tell me, for my own good, how you manage to feel so well disposed toward people, toward everybody. Who? Me? Oh, I just drink a bucket of beer every time I get thirsty, and every time I begin to feel mean, I go out and dance with the girls pretty near all night. The bigger they are, the easier I swing 'em. He leaned back and laughed until things in the room shook. A book fell off the table. Mrs. Barron came in with the doctor then, and it remained for her to make the mistake which Barron had avoided. "You must let me pay you for your trouble," she said. "I don't know what would have happened but for you." But the extraordinary creature grasped his cap in both hands and reddened again. "Who, me?" he said. "Oh, no, Mother. I make mine flirting with beer barrels." He made his exit uneasily. They heard him whistling on the stairs. In the distance, the front door closed with a bang. "What an extraordinary creature!" exclaimed Mrs. Barron. "Yes," replied Barron. "I'm afraid he is. Extraordinary." He was remembering something about the misleading effects of a makeup. Surely this big fellow's immense body and his rough speech were only a makeup after all, hiding those qualities which even from the standpoint of a baron were most to be sought and cherished. That was what Bonnie May had tried to impress upon him. Then, with sudden anxiety, Barron turned to his mother. "Where is Bonnie May?" he asked. "She went away this afternoon," was the response. Mrs. Barron avoided her son's eyes. She spoke rather guiltily. "She went away," Barron mused disconsolately. "And it was tonight she was so eager to have somebody take her to see the break of day." End of section 23. Section 24 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. Bonnie May hides something. Barron made a wry face when he was told by Dr. Percival that he had a very badly sprained ankle and that he would have to remain on his back indefinitely. Couldn't it have been something less ladylike, he wanted to know. But Dr. Percival, being a scientific-minded person, merely glanced at him impatiently and said nothing. However, he speedily discovered that being an invalid on what might be considered a preferred plan was not without its compensations. He became the pivot around which the affairs of the household revolved. He was constantly being considered and deferred to. It had been so long since any member of the family had been disabled that his affliction, being very limited in extent, was looked upon as a sort of luxury. However, though the family gathered about his bed occasionally to hold pleasant discussions, there were times when he lay alone, and these were the most profitable, if not the most pleasant hours of all. The noises of the street, pleasantly muffled, reached him. Movements in the house were faintly audible and pleasantly homely. The sun shone with a lonely brilliance against his walls. During such periods, he took an inventory of life from a new angle. He sat in judgment upon himself like a disinterested person. Barron, disabled. Critically surveyed Barron, able to be about. Spendthrift of time and chance. That's what you are, decided Barron, disabled, directing his condemnation against Barron, well and sound. You've been thinking all the time that to be Barron was something fine. You haven't had sense enough to realize that merely being Barron wasn't being anything at all. You've got to realize that all men must be measured by just one standard. You've got to quit thinking it's right for you to do just the pleasant things, the things you like to do. You have got to go to work and take orders like any other man." Lying in his room, he obtained a new impression of Bonnie May, too. She did not return to the mansion on the day of his accident. He thought she might possibly do so after the theater hour, but the evening passed, and in due time there were the sounds of the house being closed for the night, and languid voices calling to one another on the floor below. The first long night passed, with occasional tapping on the invalid's door by Mrs. Barron. A dozen times during the night she came to see if he needed anything, to be sure that he rested comfortably. Finally, he chided her gaily for disturbing him and herself. Then, after another interval which seemed only of a few minutes, he opened his eyes again to respond to the tapping on the door, and discovered that the sun was shining into the room. It was quite late in the forenoon. "I've come with the papers," said Flora, approaching his bed like a particularly loving ministering angel. "Mother's lying down. She didn't sleep very well last night." Baron had the odd thought that people must look entirely different if you looked at them while you were lying down. Never before had Flora seemed so serene and beautiful and richly endowed with graces of person and voice. He was so pleased with his view of her that he decided not to lift his head. Then, while she arranged the papers, unconscious of his scrutiny, he read an expression in her eyes which brought him abruptly to his elbow. "Flora," he declared, "you're not happy." She laughed softly, as if to ridicule such a suggestion, but immediately there was a delicate flush in her face. "Nonsense," she said. "And somebody helpless in the house to worry about? One wouldn't dance and sing under the circumstances. I'm trying to behave becomingly, that's all." Baron disregarded this. "And as soon as I get up," he said, "I'm going to see that certain nonsense is ended. He's a dandy good fellow, that's what he is. I can't imagine what we've all been thinking about." Flora began properly enough, but the conventional falsehood she meant to utter failed to shape itself. She couldn't return her brother's glance. It occurred to her that the window shade needed adjusting. "I'm going to put a stop to certain nonsense," Baron repeated. He rattled the newspapers with decision, covertly regarding his sister, who did not trust herself to speak again. She kept her eyes averted as she left the room. Flora had opened all the papers so that the dramatic reviews came uppermost, and as Baron glanced from one to another, he forgot Flora completely. By the time he had glanced at the 5th review of the production of The Break of Day, he dropped the papers and drew a long breath. "Holy smoke!" he exclaimed, and then he returned to his reading. Baggot's play had scored an almost unprecedented success. Several of the dramatic critics had written signed articles in which they expressed unbounded praise, and from his knowledge of newspaper writing, Baron knew that even the most hardened of theater-goers had been swept off their feet by the charm and novelty of the new play. Baron gathered that a new actress had been added to the group of notable American artists as a result of the creation of the part of the sprite. But when he sought from one account to another for the name of this player, he found only the role of the sprite had been played by herself. He couldn't find her name anywhere or anything about her. But after all, the identity of even a very successful player was not the thing Baron was thinking of most. He was delighted that Baggot had been successful. It seemed that Baggot had arrived. His reflections were interpreted by his mother. She entered the room rather hurriedly. Baron realized that something must have happened, or she wouldn't have come in like that, rubbing her eyes sleepily and wearing a loose wrapper. "They're telephoning for you down at the newspaper office," she yawned. "I didn't tell them that you couldn't. I thought maybe you might like to do some writing in bed if they want you to." "No, I'm not going to do any writing in bed. I feel as if that is what I've been doing always. I'm going to wait until I can get up, and then I'm going to work in earnest." She regarded him dubiously, not understanding at all. "And what shall I say?" she asked. "Tell them I'm laid up, and that I'll be down to see them as soon as I'm able to be about." "Very well. And, Mother, don't say I've got a sprained ankle. Think of something else." Something else. Mrs. Barron succeeded now in opening her eyes to their normal width. "It doesn't sound very impressive. Everybody sprains his ankle. You might say I've broken my leg if you can't think of anything else." "A sprained ankle is a sprained ankle," was the answer he received, and he dropped back on his pillow as limply as if he had been overcome by a great flash of truth. Almost immediately, however, he heard a distant commotion on the stairway, and after an instant of whispering and murmuring in the hall, his door flew open. To his astonishment, Bonnie May literally ran into the room. Her face was colorless. She was staring at him. "What happened?" she asked in a voice which was unsteady. "Nothing, child," he exclaimed sharply. "They've alarmed you. It was nothing at all. Didn't Mother tell you?" "She told me there had been an accident and that you were in bed. I didn't wait for any more." "But you can see it's nothing. I can't understand your being so excited." She went closer to him, and he could see that her body was quivering. "Is it something that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't gone away?" she asked. "It's nothing at all, and it would have happened in any case. I've only sprained my ankle. I'm ashamed to mention such a little thing. And for goodness sake, don't look as if I'd had my head cut off and you were to blame." She sat down a distance from his bed, a strangely unhappy little creature. Her sharp uneasiness gave place to a dull, increasing apathy. She was not looking at Baron now. He couldn't stand that. "Did you see the play last night?" he asked pleasantly. She stared at him. "Did I see it?" "Certainly not. How could I?" She was studying his eyes, and swiftly the misery in her own was multiplied many times. He almost lost patience with her. "Well, good gracious, don't take it so much to heart. There will be other chances. It made good, you know. It will have a run some time. We'll see it, you and I together." "Yes," she said, and sighed. A settled look of misery returned to her eyes. She did not leave the mansion for many days. Her sprightly moods returned to her occasionally, yet it was not to be ignored that in some strange fashion she was changed. She spent much of her time in Baron's room. She became almost irritatingly eager to serve him. She seemed to be wishing to atone for something, to reestablish herself in her own confidence and respect. That was how it seemed to Baron after he had observed her studiously a score of times. Occasionally he drove her from his room, achieving this by gay upbraidings. He insisted upon having the daily lessons attended to, and it was with the liveliest interest that he listened to the little tinkling melody she played, slowly and with many an error. He realized that a great deal of progress was being made. His mother was patient, and Bonnie May was a painstaking pupil. Baggot came in the course of a day or two. He was cultivating a new sort of manner in which there was much condescension. His tone seemed to say, "You see, I succeeded, even if you did fail me." "I'm sure the play is going to be a winner," said Baron. "Oh, yes, it will go all right. I'm overhauling it a bit. We only gave it that first performance so I could see just how to finish it, and to get our copyright and that sort of thing. It will go on regularly, you know, this fall." Baggot had received his promotion, Baron reflected. He would go forward now into a more active life. He would probably be seen at the mansion a time or two again, and that would be the end of him so far as the Barons were concerned. Another visitor during those days was the beer driver, who came to inquire about Baron's condition and for further manifestations of kindness, as it appeared. Baron tried to shake his hand, but the task was too Herculean. "I might go out the back way and slip in a can, if the old lady's against it," he said, flushing readily and smiling. "It just happens that I don't care for it," said Baron. "I'm quite as much obliged to you." He thought it was rather a hopeful sign that he was genuinely pleased to see this man, who had tried to be a good neighbor. "August is my name," said the visitor as he prepared to go. "When you're near the brewery, ask for me. You could go to a dance with me some night. We got a lot of fine fellows, girls too." He said this in the tone of one who would say, "You're plenty good enough to go with me." Then he, too, was gone. The days passed, more days than Baron liked to count, and still Bonnie May did not go over to the Thornburgs, but haunted Baron's room early and late, between lesson hours, and tried in 1,000 ways to serve him. He made curious discoveries touching her. Often she stood by the window looking out, and he marveled to see her body become possessed by some strange spirit within her. Her very flesh seemed to be thinking, to be trying to become articulate. And when she looked at him after such a period as this, she suddenly shrank within herself and gazed at him with a wistfulness so intense that he felt an eager wish to help her, yet also a strange helplessness. Once he cried, "You strange little creature, what is it?" But she only shook her head slowly and whispered, "Nothing," though he saw that her eyes filled with tears. Finally, Dr. Percival called again. 3 weeks had passed since the patient had been put to bed, and announced that if Baron would confine his activities to the house for a few days longer, he might safely get up. End of section 24. Section 25 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. Bonnie May sees 2 faces at a window. It was at luncheon, and Baron was downstairs for the first time since his accident. "It's just like having Johnny come back from the war," observed Bonnie May, as the family took their places at table. Baron Sr. was not there, He usually spent his midday hour at his club. "From the war, Johnny?" replied Baron. He stood by his chair an instant, putting most of his weight on one foot. "I mean, you can think of so many delicious things. We might believe you were wounded, you know, coming home to see your wife and daughter, as if the sentries had allowed you to come in for a little while. They would be outside now watching. Men with dirty faces and heavy boots." "Yes, if I had a wife and daughter," suggested Baron. "Oh, well, Flora and I. Anyway, you've got a mother, and that's the real thing when there's any soldier business." "It's a real thing anyway," observed Mrs. Baron. "Yes, of course," admitted the child. She sighed deeply. How was anyone to get anywhere with so many literal-minded people about? She remembered the man in the play who said, "If we are discovered, we are lost," and the other who replied, "No, if we are discovered, we are found." It was Mrs. Baron who returned to prosaic affairs. "I'm going out this afternoon," she said briskly. "I've been tied up here in the house 3 Thursdays. There are people I simply must call on." Bonnie May did not know why her heart should have jumped at this announcement. Still, there seemed to be no end to the possibilities for enjoyment in a big house when there wasn't anybody to be saying continuously, "You must," or "You mustn't." She wandered upstairs as soon as luncheon was over, and in Baron's room she was overcome by an irresistible impulse. She heard the houseman moving about in the next room, and the thought occurred to her that she had never seen the houseman's room. She had never even spoken to the houseman. There was something quite mysterious about the fact that he always kept to himself. Mrs. Shepherd had assured her on one occasion that Thomason never had a word to say to anybody, that he was a perverse and sullen creature. Now it occurred to her that possibly Mrs. Shepherd's estimate might lack fairness. Anyway, it would be interesting to find out for herself. It would be a kind of adventure. She tapped lightly on Thomason's door. After an interval of silence, during which one might have thought that the room itself was amazed, there was the sound of heavy feet approaching. The door opened and Thomason stood on the threshold. Bonnie May had never been near enough to him to really see him before. Now she discovered that he had quaint creases about his mouth and eyes, and that his eyes were like violets. It was as if you had dropped some violets accidentally, and they had fallen in a strange place. There was a childish expression in Thomason's eyes, and it occurred to Bonnie May that possibly he was afraid of people. It seemed to her quite shocking that the little man should remain by himself always, because he was afraid of mingling with people. Thomason's eyes were very bright as he looked at her. Then he winked slowly to facilitate thought. He was thinking, "She's the one who does whatever she pleases." Despite his habits of seclusion, Thomason was by no means oblivious to the life that went on in the mansion. "May I come in?" asked Bonnie May. She did not worry about the absence of a spontaneous welcome. It's an adventure, she was thinking. Thomason laboriously turned about with a slight list to leeward, and ambled to the middle of the room, where he sat down on a bench. He took up a pair of steel-rimmed glasses from which one temple had been broken and replaced by a piece of twine. He slipped the twine over his head and adjusted the glasses on his nose. It seemed necessary for him to sit quite still to keep this contrivance in place. When he reached around to his bed for a coat, which he had evidently been mending, he held his head and body as rigid as possible. Bonnie May advanced into the room, her hands clasped before her, her eyes quite freely surveying her surroundings. "What a quaint setting," she observed. Thomason jerked his needle through a tough place and pulled it out to arm's length, holding his head with painful sedateness on account of the glasses. He seemed afraid to glance to left or right. He made no reply at all. "I've been learning to use a needle too," she confided, thinking that he did not do it very skillfully. Thomason held his head as far back as possible and closed one eye. He was thus handicapping himself, it appeared, in order to get a better view of the work he held on his knee. "Would you like me to hold it while you go across the room to look?" she asked. Thomason suddenly became quite rigid. It was as if his works had run down. He was thinking about what Bonnie May had said. Then, "Women," he muttered, and the work seemed to have been wound up again. This seemed a somewhat indefinite and meager return for so much cheerful effort, and Bonnie May decided not to try any more just then. She went to the gable window and looked out. She was almost on a level with the fourth story of the building next door, which had been remodeled for use as a boarding house. And looking up into the window nearest her, she suddenly became animated in the most extraordinary manner. A man was looking down at her, and in his eyes there was a puzzled expression to match the puzzled expression in her own. She turned with subdued excitement to Thomason, sitting on his bench near the middle of the room, with his bed and an old trunk for a shabby background. If he would only go away! She looked up at the man in the window opposite and smiled. In a guarded tone, she remarked, "It's a very nice day," and instantly she turned toward Thomason again, so that he might believe she was addressing him in the event of his looking up from his work. But Thomason, believing this needless remark had been addressed to him, had borne enough. He arose laboriously, grasping his coat in one hand and his spectacles in the other, and left the room. At the door there was a muttered, "Women," and then a bang. Bonnie May clasped her hands in delighted relief and drew closer to the window. "It's Clifton!" she exclaimed to the man in the window opposite. "It's Bonnie May!" came back the eager response. "Oh," she moaned. She smiled up at the man across the open space helplessly. Then she took her left hand into her right hand and shook it affectionately. "You dear thing," came back the word from Clifton. "Where have you been?" "Oh, why can't I get at you?" was Bonnie May's rejoinder, and she looked down at the ground and shuddered at the abysmal depths. The man she had called Clifton disappeared for a moment, and when he stood at the window again, there was someone close beside him, looking out over his shoulder. "And Jack, too," she breathed eagerly yet fearfully. It occurred to her that someone must hear her and drag her back into the tedious realm of conventionality again. For the moment, she was almost inclined to regard herself as a kidnapped person held apart from friends and rescuers. If it isn't the kid, was the comment of the second man, and his eyes beamed happily. You both rooming over there? Asked Bonnie May. Since yesterday. We've got an engagement at the Folly. And to think of your being within... Oh, I can't talk to you this way. I must get to you. You and Miss Barry stopping there? Why, you see, I'm not working just now. Miss Barry... She stopped suddenly, her eyes filling with terror. She had heard a step behind her. Turning, she beheld Baron in the doorway. I thought I heard you talking, he said in quite a casual tone. Was Thomason here? I was talking to Thomason. My back was turned. He seems to have gone out. She looked about the room, even under the bed. She didn't want Baron to see her eyes for a moment. Such a quaint old gentleman, isn't he? She commented. She had moved away from the window. She had almost regained her composure now. Baron's brows contracted. He glanced toward the window at which she had been standing. In the depths of the room beyond, he thought he could detect a movement. He was not sure. Do you and Thomason talk to each other quite a little? He asked. He tried to make his tone lightly inconsequential. That wouldn't express it so far as he is concerned. He won't talk to me at all. I have to do all the talking. And do you feel quite confidential toward him? Why, I think you might feel safe in talking to him. He doesn't seem the sort that carries tales. Baron went to the window and looked out. He could see nobody. But when he confronted her again, his expression was harsh. There was an angry light in his eyes. Bonnie May, you were talking to someone in the other house. You were mentioning Miss Barry. You weren't talking to Thomason at all. She became perfectly still. She was now looking at him steadily. I was talking to Thomason until he went out, she said. Then, as you say, I was talking to someone in the other house. Why? Why not? The docility of the home life, the eagerness to be pliant and sweet fell from her wholly. An old influence had been brought to bear upon her, and she was now Bonnie May, the actress again. For the moment, benefits and obligations were forgot, and the old freedom was remembered. We don't know the people in that house, retorted Baron. That isn't my fault. I happen to know two of them. If you like, I'll introduce you. Very clever people. Her tone was almost flippant. Baron was astounded. You found friends, he said. He couldn't help speaking with a slight sneer. You don't do it very well, she said. I could show you how, if you cared to learn, though it's rather out of date. Bonnie May, he cried reproachfully. You made me do it, she said, suddenly forlorn and regretful. I didn't do anything. That's a rooming house over there, and I happened to see two old friends of mine at the window. They were glad to see me, and I was glad to see them. That's all. Her expression darkened with discouragement. She added, and I wasn't quite untruthful. I had been talking to Thomason. Baron meditatively plucked his lower lip between his finger and thumb. I was wrong, he said. I admit I was in the wrong. He tried to relieve the situation by being facetious. You know I've been an invalid, he reminded her, and people are always patient with invalids. It's all right, she said. And he had the disquieting realization that she had grown quite apart from him, for the moment at least, and that it didn't matter to her very much now whether he was disagreeable or not. She sighed and walked absent-mindedly from the room. She remembered to turn in the doorway and smile at him amiably, but he felt the action was polite rather than spontaneous. And he reflected, after she had gone away, that she hadn't volunteered to say a word about the people she had talked to through the window. End of section 25. Section 26 of Bonnie May by Lewis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. A gathering in the attic. When Bonnie May went downstairs and learned that Mrs. Barron had gone out calling, she entered her own room and pushed her door partly shut so that she would be invisible to anyone passing. Her most earnest wish for the moment was to see her two friends next door. Of course, she would see them before long, but she did not like to leave the matter to chance. There was no reason why she should not simply go to their front door and knock and ask for them. No reason, but undoubtedly a prejudice. The Barrons wouldn't approve of such a thing. She really hadn't been aware of the existence of the house next door until now. She realized that there were worlds between the people who lived over there and the people who lived in the mansion. So far as she was concerned, the Barrons were a family, while heaven only knew what those other people were. Well, she would think of some way of getting at Clifton and Jack some other time. Something would happen. And in the meantime, Mrs. Barron was gone, and there were various things which might be done now which couldn't be done at any other time. Rummaging among her possessions in search of an inspiration, she came upon a hat covered with little silk butterflies. She had the liveliest appreciation of the silk butterflies, though she did not quite approve of the shape of the hat upon which they were bestowed. On the other hand, there was a hat of adorable shape which had an insufficient decoration in the form of a spray of roses which were not of the right color and which were in too advanced a stage of development. In another moment, a small pair of scissors was traveling over one of the hats with a snipping sound and a startling, destructive effect. The snipping was not suspended until voices, subdued and confidential, arose in the nearby sitting room. Barron had come downstairs too and was talking to Flora. "The thing for us to do," Barron was saying, "is to go places and let him know about it beforehand. Any place at all, for a walk in the park or to the theater. I wouldn't be in the way. I would know what to do. And after, that is to say, when. What I mean is that in the course of time, you could just tell Mother that you've made up your mind and that it's your business and not hers. The thing is absurd. She's got no reasons. We've no right to let her have her own way entirely in such a case." Bonnie May dropped the hat into her lap and paid no attention to the shower of butterflies and roses which fell to the carpet. Quite stealthily, she went out into the hall. A moment of indecision, and then she descended the stairs to the first floor. "There's that to be attended to, too," she was reflecting. She went to the telephone immediately. She had noiselessly closed the dining room door so she wouldn't be heard, and after very little delay she had Mr. Addis on the other end of the wire. "It's Bonnie May," she said in response to Addis's greeting. "I called you up to tell you that you're wanted here this afternoon. It's really important. I think, honestly, you ought to come. Can you?" "Why, yes, certainly," came back the vigorous and pleasant voice of Addis. "Yes, I'll come right away." In the hall she paused, thrilled by the contemplation of a good, forbidden deed. Then the warm sunlight, finding its way in through the ground glass door, enticed her, and she went out into the vestibule. There she stood, looking out on the street. Clearly, fate was on her side. Almost immediately, two immaculately dressed gentlemen, moving with superb elegance, passed the gate. Bonnie May ran down the steps, calling to them. "Clifton" was the word that penetrated the chaos of street noises, and, "Oh, Jack!" The two gentlemen turned about, and at the sight of the child they became far less correct in their general deportment. Happiness made them quite unconscious of self. Very shortly afterward, a little girl was sitting between two altogether presentable gentlemen on the top step in front of the barren mansion. "Of course we shouldn't," admitted Bonnie May. "We never sit on the front steps. I mean, the family. But nobody will know. And besides, I don't see how we can help ourselves." "We don't mind at all," Clifton assured her. He looked inquiringly over his shoulder into the vestibule. "What is it? An old ladies' home?" "Not exactly. It's one old ladies' home, and you couldn't get in without a jimmy or a letter of introduction. She used to be a boon." "Of course, that explains it," said Clifton. "What are you doing here?" "Does she give private theatricals?" "Not intentionally. No, I'm the little daughter of the house, a kind of little Eva without any dogs or fiddles, and I have to go to bed at 9 o'clock and take lessons. It's really a wonderful place. When we all sit down to the table, it sticks. When I get across with anything neat, nobody whistles. Far from it." Clifton and Jack accepted all this as quite definitely informative. "Domesticated," explained Clifton to Jack, who nodded. "How did you find them?" Jack wanted to know. "They found me. There's a Romeo in the house who's the real thing. Love me, love my Romeo. That's how I feel about him. He brought me here." "But where—" "You see, Miss Barry wished me on to one of the theaters here last spring when the going got rough, put me down and disappeared, and he found me. I wish to goodness you and he could get acquainted. You know that I was a baby only a few years back. But just because I don't cry for bread and milk here, they seem to think I'm Mrs. Tom Thumb come back to earth. You could tell them." Clifton and Jack leaned back as far as they safely could and laughed heartily. Then they drew painfully sedate faces and sprang to their feet. A soft yet decisive voice, the voice of a young woman, sounded behind them. When Bonnie May turned around, she realized that she and her two friends were standing in a line on the bottom step, looking up into the faces of Baron and Flora, who had made their appearance in the vestibule. Flora was smiling in a pleasantly mischievous manner. Baron was regarding the two actors critically, yet not with unfriendliness. "Won't you introduce your friends?" asked Flora. Bonnie May did so. She concluded with, "Old friends of mine in the profession." "If I might suggest," said Flora, "it's ever so much more comfortable in the house, if you don't mind coming in." She turned to Baron with slightly heightened color. Her glance seemed to say, You can see they are gentlemen." Something of constraint passed from her eyes when Baron pushed the door open and turned to the two men who were in the profession and led the way into the house. "Delighted," said Clifton, mounting the steps, followed by the other actor. "You're very welcome on your own account," said Baron. "And besides, we all like to do anything we can to please Mrs. Tom Thumb." He glanced sharply at Bonnie May, who nodded in her best manner and remarked with delicacy of intonation, "Caught with the goods." The little joke paved the way for really comfortable intercourse, and there was a highly satisfactory condition of sociability in the sitting room upstairs half an hour later when the street bell rang. It rang as if it were in the nature of a challenge, and the ring was almost immediately repeated. "Mrs. Shepherd must be out," said Flora. She went to respond. It was only the McKelvey girls after all. Bonnie May heard their gay voices in the lower hall, and it occurred to her that there was danger of certain complications which might not be wholly agreeable. She turned to Baron. "You know, we've 100 things to talk about, old times and old friends. Couldn't we go up into your room until the company goes?" She referred to herself and the actors, of course. In his heart, Baron could have blessed her for the thought. The McKelvey girls were on their way upstairs, and he was not sure about the propriety of bringing the McKelvey girls into even a fleeting relationship with two actors whom none of them knew. "Why, if you like," he said with an air of reluctance, which he fully overcame by the promptness with which he arose and got the child and her friends started on their way. Flora might have decided to entertain her callers in the room downstairs if she had had any choice in the matter. But the McKelvey girls had always felt wholly at home in the mansion, and they had begun climbing the stairs before Flora closed the street door. Flora paused for an instant, changing from one arm to the other the huge bundle of flowers the elder Miss McKelvey had thrust at her upon entering. A wan, resigned smile trembled on her lips, and then she tossed her head ever so slightly. "Oh, what's the difference?" she explained to herself, and then she followed the others up the broad flight of stairs. Still, she was somewhat relieved to find no one but her brother in the room into which the visitors led the way. She did not know just what had happened, but she did not ask any questions. And then she heard the murmur of voices up in the attic and understood. She brought a vase and put the flowers into it. "Don't they look beautiful?" she asked. She had to lift her voice a little, because both of the McKelvey girls were talking at once. "They certainly do," came the response in a wholly unexpected voice, and Flora turned and beheld the animated face of Mrs. Harrod framed in the doorway. "Mrs. Shepherd asked me to come up," said Mrs. Harrod. She looked about her as if the room were empty. "Flora," she demanded, "where's that child?" She had laid eager hands upon Flora's shoulders and kissed her flushed cheek with genuine affection. She had also taken a second to glance at the McKelvey girls and say, "How do, young ladies?" "Child?" echoed Miss Barron. "That perfect little creature who was here the last time I was. I did hope she'd let me in again. Such angelic manners. You don't mean to say you've let her go?" "Oh, Bonnie May! No, she hasn't gone. She's quite one of us now. Where is she, Victor?" Baron fidgeted. "She went up into the attic, I believe." Mrs. Harrod made for the hall immediately. "I'm sure you don't mind," she said, without turning around. They heard her climbing the second flight of stairs. "You young people won't miss me," she called back. The younger Miss McKelvey suddenly sat up very straight. "What's the matter with you, Flora Barron?" she demanded. "The matter?" "The way you're looking at Victor." "Yes, and the way he's looking at you. What's the mystery?" Flora listened. Upstairs a door opened and shut, and then there was silence. "I was wondering if Mrs. Harrod would find things just to her liking up there," she explained. "Oh, well, if she doesn't, it will be her own fault. People who take possession of a house can't be too particular." "I suppose not," admitted Flora thoughtfully. She was listening intently again. There was a movement downstairs. Mrs. Shepherd was serenely complaining to herself on the ground of many interruptions. The street door opened and shut, and Flora heard resonant, familiar tones. Barron heard them too. "I'll see," Mrs. Shepherd was heard to say, and then there was the sound of her heavy tread on the stairs. Again Flora and Victor looked at each other dubiously. "What is the matter with you?" demanded Miss McKelvey, the other Miss McKelvey this time. Flora leaned back against the mantel almost limply and laughed, not the laugh of Bonnie May's lessons, but the old contralto gurgle. "Nothing," she said. Her cheeks flamed. Her eyes were filled with a soft light. "Mr. Addis has called to see Miss Barron," announced Mrs. Shepherd truculently in the doorway. "I'll go right down," said Flora. "Oh!" exclaimed the elder Miss McKelvey. "Oh!" echoed her sister. They arose as by a common impulse and stole out into the hall. "We don't care if we do," they flung back in a whisper as they tiptoed to the stair railing. They came hurrying back with ecstatic twitterings. "You know you never entertained company in that dark room downstairs, Flora Barron. You've got to bring him up." Flora gazed at them in rebellious misery. "Well, then," exclaimed the younger Miss McKelvey, seizing her sister's hand, "we'll go up into the attic." And they were gone. "Oh," cried Flora helplessly, "it shows what one criminal act will lead to." "There was no criminal act," retorted Barron. "Nothing is really wrong. Have him up." His tone seemed to say, "Assert your right. I'll back you up." He went to the head of the stairway. "Come right up, Addis," he called. He tried to throw a great deal of cordiality into his voice. Flora's hands went to her temples in a gesture of despair. "You invited him here in Mother's absence. You know you did," she cried. "I didn't, but I wouldn't care if I had. I've had done it if I'd had wit to think of it. Why shouldn't he come?" "I won't have him come in this way. Until Mother," she slipped from the room without finishing her sentence. "What do you intend to do?" demanded Barron. "There's only one thing to do. I think I may be needed elsewhere just now. I'm going up into the attic." But as she made her escape, she glanced down the stairs. Somebody was coming up. There was the stubborn black hair, the ruddy cheeks, and the close-cropped black mustache. But she was gone. Mr. Addis mounted the stairs with the determination of one who goes more than halfway to meet destiny. "Come in," called Barron. "Excuse me for not coming to meet you. You know I've got a bad ankle." Yes, said Mr. Addis, whose robust presence somehow had the effect of making all the aspects of the room effeminate and trivial. You were expecting me? No, that is, bungled Barron, we're delighted to have you call. Addis reflected. And Miss Barron? He asked. She's up in the attic just now. There are some callers, I believe. A dull flush mounted to the visitor's forehead. I'm afraid I made a mistake, he said. He arose, casting a keen glance at Barron. You didn't. You didn't make any mistake at all. We won't wait for them to come down. Come, let's follow if you don't mind. Follow, said Addis. We'll go up to the attic. End of section 26.
Chapter 27 of Bonnie May. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. Chapter 27. What Happened in the Attic. When Bonnie May got up into the attic, she gave one swift thought to the fact that Mr. Addis would be coming to the house before long, and that she would not be free to receive him. Flora would be surprised to see him, but then she concluded Flora ought to think all the more highly of him if she decided that he had come without waiting for an invitation. Then her mind was diverted from Mr. Addis and his affairs. It was diverted by an impulse which compelled her to put her arm swiftly about Clifton's neck and Jack's, and express again her joy at seeing them. "You dear boys," she exclaimed. "It makes me feel so good and so bad to see you again. Oh, those old days." They all found chairs, and for a little time, Bonnie May leaned forward in hers, her shoulders drooping, her eyes filled with yearning. Then she aroused herself. "Do you remember the time we went to Cheyenne in sort of a coach, and the soldiers made us have a dinner, a Christmas dinner, with them?" she asked. Clifton remembered. He said, "And you put on a cap that came way down over your eyes," and ran into the fat old captain, who had come in unbeknownst, as one of the soldiers said, to inspect the quarters. Said Bonnie May, "And the soldiers wanted us to change our play, The Captain's Daughter, so that it would be a military play instead of a sea story." There was a moment of silence, and then, for no apparent reason, the child and her visitors joined in a chorus of laughter. "That old play, I remember every word of the heroine's part," said Bonnie May. "She wasn't much, was she? I remember wishing I was big enough to have the part instead of her." She shook her head gently in the ecstasy of recalling the old atmosphere, the old ambitions, the old adventures. Then she clasped her hands and exclaimed, "Let's do an act of it just for fun. Oh, let's do. If you could only think how hungry I've been." She did not wait for an answer. She hurried to Thomason's door and knocked. Her movements expressed a very frenzy of desire, of need. When Thomason did not respond, she opened his door and looked into his room. "He's not here," she exclaimed. "Come, his things will make the grandest sailors out of you." She had them in Thomason's room in no time. "But we can't both be sailors," objected Jack. "We'll need a captain." "We'll imagine him. He'll be out of sight somewhere." She opened Thomason's trunk. "It's not Romeo's, is it?" asked Clifton dubiously. Bonnie May only emitted a little scream of delight. She had caught sight of 2 red bandana handkerchiefs. She had them out swiftly, also a new canvas coat and an old one. Then she heard someone entering the room. Thomason came and stood beside her to see what she was doing. He looked into the trunk as if he were curious to see what was in it. Her manner betrayed no confusion at all. "So glad you've come," she said. "It's going to be a play. Oh, the very thing. You can be one of the sailors, Thomason, and then we can have the captain too." She appealed to Clifton and Jack. "Won't he make a perfectly splendid sailor?" she demanded. They agreed that he would be an ideal sailor. Thomason hadn't the slightest idea what it all meant. But when she tied one of the red bandana handkerchiefs in a special fashion around the neck of one of the actors, he concluded that it was going to be some kind of a game. Or possibly, he feared, he was going to lose his handkerchiefs. "Put one on me," he suggested. And Bonnie May put one on him. Then she happened to look at one of the window shades. "Earrings!" she exclaimed. They used to look so delightfully wicked. With Clifton's aid, she removed several brass rings from the window shades. "I won't need them," said Clifton. "You know I was the captain." So the rings were hung in Jack's ears and Thomason's. "Splendid!" cried Bonnie May. She inspected the result critically. "If we only had— Thomason, is there any blacking?" Thomason found a box of blacking in Barron's room. She dipped her finger into it and drew a series of sinister lines across Jack's unlined face. Clifton proffered a criticism. "You're putting on too much. He's to be a sailor, not a pirate." "No, only a sailor, but he ought to look a little frightful." She stood back in admiration of her work. Thomason had begun more clearly to understand. "Put some on me," he invited. Clifton, in the meantime, had found a golf cap, which had been handed down from Barron to Thomason. It did not make a thoroughly realistic captain of him, but it was the best he could do. He was trying to recall some of the telling phrases in The Captain's Daughter. He could improvise if necessary. He looked on seriously while Bonnie May put the finishing touches on Thomason's face. It was then that Mrs. Harrod appeared. "Oh, I'm sure I'm intruding," she cried. She looked with profound amazement at every face in the room. "You're not intruding at all," declared Bonnie May. "It's to be a play, you know. You can be the audience, if you will." Mrs. Harrod began to laugh almost helplessly. Then she checked herself because she perceived that Bonnie May was deeply in earnest. "Of course," she responded. "I make a very good audience. I'll be delighted to help." She took a chair and became immediately a highly inspiring audience. Still, she was amazed. She had never been told by any of the Barons that Bonnie May had formerly been of the profession. "We'll do only the third act," decided Bonnie May, addressing the two actors, "where the ship sinks and the raft is seen at sea." She ended by glancing at Mrs. Harrod, who nodded as if she really preferred to witness only the third act. "We'll need a raft, of course," she said. She glanced about the room. The trunk was not large enough to hold two and contribute to a realistic effect. "It will have to be the bed," she decided. "Thomason, you and Jack will sit on the bed, and you'll have to remember that you're on a raft in a storm. The storm is so severe that you nearly fall off the raft." "Is it?" asked Thomason. He seemed incredulous. "It will be. Jack will let you know when. You look at him once in a while and do just as he does." There was an explosion of shrill laughter in the adjoining room, and then the McKelvey girls appeared. They seemed quite startled and ready to run, even after they saw Mrs. Harrod. But Mrs. Harrod reassured them. "Come right in," she called cordially. "It's to be a play, and as yet we have a miserably small audience." They drifted a little farther into the room, wide-eyed. It was here that Clifton rebelled. "Oh, look here," he protested. "It will look so silly." "Just because we have an audience?" retorted Bonnie May blankly. Then, with feeling, "If you got used to playing to empty seats, it will do you good to have somebody looking at you. Now do be sensible." "I shall be awfully disappointed not to see the play, that is, the third act," protested Mrs. Harrod. "Well, go ahead," said Clifton, but he looked decidedly shamefaced. Bonnie May took her position in the middle of the room. She meant to explain what it was they were about to do. She did not know that Flora had come in and was standing just inside the door. Nor did she know that Victor and Mr. Addis also arrived a moment later. "This is a situation," she began. "I am the daughter of the captain of a sailing vessel. Two of the sailors love me, but they have to keep still about it, because I am so far above them. We're all on a ship on a voyage, you understand. I love one of the sailors, but I'm afraid to admit it for fear my father will be angry. Then one of the sailors speaks to my father about his love for me, you know. But my father tells him he must never be guilty of such boldness again. Then the 2 sailors lead a mutiny in the hope of getting control of the ship, but the mutiny fails, and the 2 leaders are put in irons. I feel so sorry for them that I plan their escape. I know I cannot marry either of them, but I pity them just the same. So I take some of the rest of the crew into my confidence, and they make a raft in secret. Then one night when we are within sight of land, I get the other sailors to let them go, the 2 men who are in irons, and throw them overboard together with the raft. I mean it all for their own good, though they make the mistake of thinking I wish to have them murdered. Of course, my father isn't allowed to know anything about all this. It's done while he is asleep. A likely story, interpolated Clifton. A very fine situation, amended Bonnie May. It is arranged that the sailors who have helped me are to tell my father when he wakes up that the 2 prisoners made their escape and were trying to murder him when they, the other sailors, threw them overboard in a desperate fight. Then comes the 3rd act, which we are about to present. A storm comes up and the ship strikes a rock. We are about to sink when the raft drifts into sight. The 2 sailors who were prisoners are on it. My father urges me to join the sailors on the raft so that I may be saved, but I know they believe I plotted their murder, and I am as much afraid of them as I am of the sinking ship. The climax comes when the ship sinks and I am thrown into the sea. Of course, the 2 sailors rescue me. Now we will imagine the curtain has just gone up on the 3rd act. She turned for an inspection of the company and caught sight of Flora, Victor, and Mr. Addis just inside the doorway. "Don't mind us," said Flora. "We hope we're not interrupting." But Bonnie May was not to be embarrassed now. She scarcely took pains to answer beyond a swift, "Not at all," and was earnestly shaping her mood for the work ahead of her. Her intensity had created a really strange atmosphere. Nothing louder than a whisper could be heard in the room, and even whispering soon ceased. "Now, Captain or Father, take your place on the bridge where you belong." Clifton proceeded with the utmost seriousness to climb up on Thomason's table. He stood at one end so that there would be room for Bonnie May also. "The sailors will now take their places on the raft," was the next order. "You know you're not supposed to be visible until you hear the line, 'The ship is sinking,' and then you want to remember that you are in a violent storm." Jack and Thomason climbed to the middle of the bed and sat down awkwardly, both looking in the same direction, like rowers in a boat. "And remember you have paddles in your hands," reminded Bonnie May. "I have a paddle," responded Jack. "I ain't," objected Thomason. "Oh, yes, you have," declared Jack. "One just like mine." He took a stroke with an imaginary paddle held suitably. "Well, I have a paddle," conceded Thomason. Bonnie May then was helped to the bridge beside Clifton. Clifton began. He was not quite sure about the lines, but he recalled the situation clearly enough. "Best go below, my daughter," were the words which filled the room with a ringing effect. "I have not seen a gull since the second watch ended, and they do not hide from ordinary storms. I fear we may be caught in a tempest." End of chapter 27, read by Kimberly Bonin.
Section 28 of Bonnie May by Lewis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. After the curtain was lowered. Mrs. Barron had returned from her calling expedition earlier than she had expected to. She had had a feeling that something might go wrong. Prescience is really a wonderful thing. Now, as the poor lady stood within Thomason's room, she was quite terrified. For the moment, there had been a dreadful din. And now, looking at Thomason, she caught the rebellious expression in his round, innocent eyes. She saw that he had brass rings in his ears. Unfortunately, she did not associate the brass rings with the window blinds. And his face was horribly streaked. His right leg was sticking up in air quite inelegantly, and he was clawing at some other unspeakable person in an effort to regain his equilibrium. And then there was Bonnie May, with an insane light in her eyes. And behind Bonnie May was a smirking creature who grinned maliciously at Mrs. Barron, as if he and she shared some guilty secret in common. Certainly, she did not know the man. Moreover, there stood Flora, looking unspeakably demure, with the man Addis by her side. Addis was looking as if her arrival had provoked him. His look seemed to say, "If you don't like it, why don't you run along?" Mrs. Barron did not stop to take in any of the others. At first she was speechless, as the saying is, though she was trying to shape certain comments which she meant to direct at Bonnie May. She opened her mouth once and again quite helplessly. Then she found her voice. "You little limb of Satan!" The words came with difficulty. In that instant, her features looked quite unlovely. Bonnie May might have told her that elderly people ought never, under any circumstances, to become violently angry. But Bonnie May was in no condition to utter elemental truths. "You awful little wretch," added Mrs. Barron. "No sooner do I turn my back than you disgrace me. You open my door to the whole street." Bonnie May was blinking rapidly. She was very pale. If you dreamed that you were finding large sums of money, and someone threw a bucket of cold water on you, and you woke up to find yourself in the poorhouse, that perhaps fairly describes her mental state. She had not been quite sorry that the bed collapsed. Some of the secondary cells in her brain had been warning her as she stood on the bridge that the third act could scarcely be made to come to a true climax. She couldn't be projected into the sea, really. She would have to step tamely down from the table and begin to talk in a commonplace fashion. Under favorable conditions, the collapse of the bed would have been a relief. But now she stood looking at Mrs. Barron, trying to reach her soul through her angry eyes. She shrank so from being humiliated before her friends, the old and the new. If Mrs. Barron, who had been so kind in many unimportant ways and times, could only spare her now. "If you will permit me, madam," began Clifton. "Who are these gentlemen?" demanded Mrs. Barron, still wrathfully regarding Bonnie May. Bonnie May and no other. "They are my friends," said Bonnie May. "They have known me always, and really, you know, we weren't doing anything wrong." Clifton had assisted her to the floor, and now, after an appealing step in Mrs. Barron's direction, and the swift conclusion that nothing she could do would save the situation, she broke into tears and staggered from the room. "Bonnie May!" called Clifton, with overflowing solace in his tone. He ran after Bonnie May. The other actor, casting brass rings and red bandana to the floor, followed. "Emily Boone!" The voice of Mrs. Harrods. "I think you might blame us if it's all so terrible. We encouraged her. We enjoyed it." Mrs. Barron now turned toward the assembled group. She seemed dazed. I didn't know you were here, she said, her voice trembling weakly. And then, I don't care. What would any woman do coming home and finding strangers and such a scene in her house? We invited them in, Mother, confessed Barron weakly. Yes, echoed Flora. They were old companions of Bonnie May's, and we thought it would be nice to invite them in. And I suppose you invited him in, too? Retaliated Mrs. Barron, indicating Addis by a scornful, slight movement of her head. The effect of this upon Flora was most distressing. Could her mother so far forget herself as to reveal family differences in the presence of Mrs. Harrod and the McKelvey girls? Her wounded eyes fairly begged for mercy. Addis promptly came to her relief. No, she didn't, Mrs. Barron. I just dropped in. His voice, by reason of its bigness and calmness, had the effect of making everyone in the room feel how petty and needless had been the unpleasantness which Mrs. Barron's arrival had created. His hair seemed more bristling than ever as he added, "If you will permit me, I'll bid you good day." He made a rather stiff bow, which was meant to include everyone in the room, and turned to go. But here Mrs. Harrod interfered again. "Peter," she called. The uttering of the unfamiliar given name created profound surprise in certain minds. "Peter," she repeated, "I won't have you go away like that. I want you to know Mrs. Barron better than you seem to know her. She doesn't mean half she says. Emily, tell him I'm right." She looked commandingly at Mrs. Barron. It was evident that she had a nature which was not to be subdued by trivial mishaps. Mrs. Barron flinched. "Who is Peter?" she demanded feebly. "If you don't know, I advise you to cultivate your son's friends. Do you mean that you don't know Peter Addis? Why, he's been like a son of mine. You ought to have known how fond I and the Colonel are of him. I'm surprised you've never met him at our house." "I never did," said Mrs. Barron, swallowing with difficulty. "Well, for goodness sake, let's go downstairs. Please excuse me for suggesting Emily in your house, and behave ourselves. I suppose we've all been at fault, all except that delightful child. I'm going to find her and tell her so." "It was so funny," declared the elder Miss McKelvey, appealing tremulously to Mrs. Barron and patting her on the arm. She thought of laughing, which was, she believed, the easiest thing to do in all sorts of circumstances. Mrs. Harrod's brain was working energetically. She had been reading various faces, and she realized that even yet Mrs. Barron had not spoken to Addis. She drew conclusions. On the way downstairs, she kept Addis close to her. "Do you know, Peter," she said in large, cheerful tones, "I think it's downright shabby for you to neglect us as you have been of late. I miss those old evenings so, when you and the Colonel used to come in from hunting and sit down and eat like two famished boys and bring the atmosphere of outdoors with you. Do you remember how the dogs used to slip into the house in spite of the Colonel's scolding and put their heads on your knees while you ate supper? Those were the occasions that made a home worth having." Addis, entirely satisfied with the turn affairs were taking, responded eagerly, "I certainly do remember. I've often wondered if the Colonel had Queenie yet. There was a dog for you." "Oh, no, Queenie's been dead over a year. It's Prince and Hector now, Queenie's puppies. The colonel says they're every bit as smart as their mother was. I wish you'd come out soon, on a Sunday if you'd rather find us alone. We'll sit out under the grape arbor. You know the grapes are just getting ripe. Those little vines have grown up beautifully. The colonel always has his bottle of what do you call it out there, and his pipe, and I send the servants away and prepare a little lunch." They were in the sitting room now, too eagerly engaged in their conversation to think of sitting down, and Mrs. Barron was waiting humbly to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Harrod was not unmindful of her old friend's discomfort, but she had an idea she was engaged in giving a patient a dose of medicine, and thought she ought to be careful that none of it was spilled. "If you'll excuse me," said Mrs. Barron, now thoroughly dejected, "I'll look for Bonnie May. I think I ought to have a talk with her." She had heard every word that Mrs. Harrod had spoken to Mr. Addis, and she had heard enough. She went to Bonnie May's room. She was too confused to realize that Flora accompanied her. But as she stood staring miserably into the empty room, she heard Flora's comforting voice. "She's probably downstairs, Mother, with her friends." Flora went to the stairway and called. There was no response. She listened, anxiously turning her eyes toward her mother, but there was no sound of voices on the floor below. "They wouldn't have remained in the house a minute," declared Mrs. Barron, who was now frankly remorseful. "But Bonnie May, she may have gone back to talk to Mrs. Shepherd," suggested Flora. They could hear Mrs. Harrod's voice pleasantly masterful. She had introduced Addis to the McKelvey girls, now that she had happened to think of it, and they were slipping eager gusts of laughter and discontented phrases into the conversation. Mrs. Barron and Flora went downstairs and appealed to Mrs. Shepherd. Bonnie May had gone out, Mrs. Shepherd said. She had come downstairs and telephoned something in great haste, and then she had induced her two gentlemen friends to go away. An automobile had come quite promptly, and she had gone away in it. Mrs. Barron turned away from her daughter and rested her hand against the wall at the foot of the staircase. Her attitude spelled repentance and fear. She went up into the child's room, and Flora followed close enough to hear a low, tremulous cry of despair. "I wouldn't, Mother," soothed Flora, whose eager voice brought Mrs. Harrod and the others. Mrs. Barron was standing beside a little work table and a chair that were Bonnie May's. Her face was quivering. "I'm a disagreeable old creature," she declared. "I don't deserve to have any happiness." One hand fumbled with a handkerchief, which she lifted to her eyes. From the other, slowly relaxing, a handful of roses and ridiculous little silk butterflies fluttered slowly to the floor. "I want you all to leave me, please," she begged. "I'm not fit to be seen." She put forth a hand to Mrs. Harrod. "Do come back again soon," she begged. "And you too," she added, extending her hand to the McKelvey girls. And then, as she dabbed her discolored eyes, she concluded with, "And you too." She glanced aside, but her hand went out to Addis. Then she disappeared into her own room and softly closed the door. Flora's eyes were shining as she escorted the party downstairs. "She's only gone to visit friends," she declared. "She'll be back." The McKelvey girls burst from the front door ahead of the others. They were cheerful creatures who were not to be depressed long by the scenes they had just witnessed. Flora, standing in the hall to let the others pass, heard them shrieking joyously, "Oh, what a lovely new car you've got, Mrs. Harrod!" And then she heard Mrs. Harrod explaining as she emerged into the sunlight, "A birthday present from the Colonel." They had all passed out now except Addis, and when Flora opened the door a little wider for him, he stood still an instant and looked out. The others were out there inspecting Mrs. Harrod's new car. Then he took Flora's hand in his and closed the door firmly and securely. It was fully a minute before the door was opened again, and Addis descended the steps alone. Mrs. Harrod and the McKelvey girls forgot the new machine immediately. They were all looking at Peter Addis, and they were all thinking precisely the same thing, namely that they had never in all their lives seen a man who looked more extraordinarily handsome and happy. End of section 28. Section 29 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. The Mansion in Shadow. When Bonnie May did not return to the mansion that night, the fact was not commented upon by any member of the family. It was not quite remarkable that she should spend the night with the Thornburgs. That was where she had gone, of course. It is true that Mrs. Barron was decidedly uncomfortable. The rupture that had occurred was more serious than any that had preceded it. Possibly she had gone too far. There was the possibility that Bonnie May might nurse a very proper grievance and decide that it was pleasanter to live with the Thornburgs than to continue her residence at the mansion. In brief, she might refuse to come back. That was Mrs. Barron's fear. It was a fear which hurt the more because she was unwilling to speak of it. However, when the next day passed and night came, Barron took no trouble to conceal his anxiety, for still Bonnie May had not returned. He called up the Thornburgs by telephone. Was Bonnie May there? He asked the question very affably. Yes, came back the reply in an equally affable tone. She was there. Would he like to speak to her? No, she need not be troubled. He merely wished to be sure she was there. Barron believed, without expressing his belief to anyone, that it would be a mistake to manifest anxiety about the late guest, or probably the temporary absent guest. So it came about that one day followed another, and Bonnie May did not come back, and the several members of the family pretended that nothing was specially wrong. It was Mrs. Barron who first thrust aside a wholly transparent pretense. "That's the trouble with the Thornburg arrangement," she said at dinner one day, apropos of nothing that had been said, but rather of what everybody was thinking. "I don't blame her for being offended, but if the Thornburgs were not making efforts to keep her, she'd have been back before now. On the whole, we were really very good to her." "Oh, I shouldn't worry," declared Barron briskly. "She'll be back. If she doesn't come before long, I'll go over there and toll her back." A second week passed, and she had not returned. and now her absence was making a distinct difference in the mansion. The dinner and sitting room conversations became listless, or during the course of them a tendency toward irritability was developed. One day, Mrs. Barron sought her son alone in his attic. Said she, "Do you suppose she's not coming back at all?" She looked quite wan and bereft as she asked the question. Barron felt remorseful. "Of course she is," he assured her. "I'm going over to the Thornburgs. I'm going to see about it." Bonnie May was acting foolishly, he thought. The Thornburgs were not keeping faith, yet it was a difficult matter for him to make a clear case against either Bonnie May or the Thornburgs, and he was by no means comforted by a little event which transpired one morning. He encountered the two actors as he was leaving the mansion, and his impulse was to speak to them cordially. But in returning his greeting, they manifested a well-simulated faint surprise, as if they felt sure Barron had made a mistake. They nodded politely and vaguely, and passed on. In his mind, Barron charged them angrily with being miserable cads, and he was the more angry because they had snubbed him in such an irreproachable fashion. Even Barron Sr. became impatient over the long absence of Bonnie May. Realizing that his usual practice of watching and listening was not to be effective in the present instance, he leaned back in his chair at dinner one evening and asked blandly, "What's become of the little girl?" And Mrs. Barron made a flat failure of her effort to be indifferent. Her hand trembled as she adjusted her knife and fork on her plate. "Why, I don't know," said she. "You know she has two homes." But she was afraid to attempt to look anywhere but at her plate. Barron was astounded by the utter dejection which his mother tried to conceal. Why, she loved the child, really. She was grieving for her. And that evening he emerged from the house with much grimness of manner and made for the Thornburgs. The dusk had fallen when he reached the quiet street on which the manager lived. Street lamps cast their light among the trees at intervals. In the distance, a group of children were playing on the pavement. Before the Thornburg home, silence reigned, and no one was visible. Yet as Barron neared the approach to the house, he paused abruptly. He had been mistaken in believing there was no one near. In the heavy shadow of a maple tree, someone was standing, a woman. She was gazing at the lower windows of the Thornburg residence, and there was something in her bearing which seemed covert, surreptitious. He, too, looked toward those windows. There was nothing there beyond a frankly cheerful interior. He could see no one. What was the woman looking at? He glanced at her again, and a bough, swaying in the breeze, moved from its place so that the rays from a nearby lamp shone upon the figure which appeared to be standing on guard. She was overdressed, Barron thought. Under an immense velvet hat weighted down with plumes, masses of blonde hair were visible. Her high, prominent cheekbones were not at all in keeping with the girlish bloom which had been imparted to her cheeks by a too obvious artifice. She had caught up her skirt lightly in one hand, as if the attitude were habitual, and one aggressively elegant shoe was visible. He had paused only momentarily. Now he proceeded on his way, passing the woman in the shadow with only half the width of the sidewalk between her and him. He had recognized her. She was the woman who had stood in the theater that night talking to Thornburg, who had visited Thornburg in his office. Could she be Miss Barry? Barron wondered. A maid led him into the house and drew open a sliding door, revealing the lighted but empty drawing room. She took his card and disappeared. He sat for a time, counting the heavy minutes and listening intently for sounds which did not reach him. Then the manager and his wife entered the room, both bending upon him strangely expectant glances. Barron arose. "I've taken the liberty," he began, but Thornburg instantly swept all formalities aside. "That's all right," he said. "Keep your seat." Then, obviously, they waited for something which they expected he had come to say. But he was listening for the sound of Bonnie May's voice. He seemed almost absent-minded to the man and woman who were intently regarding him. Then Thornburg, plainly afraid of offending his guest by a too impulsive or impatient word, fell back upon commonplaces. He concluded that he must wait to hear what Barron had come to say. "You've heard about Baggot's good luck?" he asked. "I think not," replied Barron, not at all cordially. "His play. They're getting ready to put it on in Chicago. His people have a theater there that's not engaged just now. There's to be an elegant production. First-class people and everything. Baggot's gone on to look after the rehearsals. We ought to have it here by the 1st of the year, or earlier, if a No. 2 company is organized." "I hadn't heard," said Barron. "I haven't seen Baggot lately." With intention, he spoke listlessly. Thornburg wasn't coming to the point, and he didn't intend to be played like a fish. An uncomfortable silence fell again, and again Barron found himself listening intently. And then he could bear the suspense no longer. He leaned toward Thornburg with animation. "Look here, Thornburg," he said. "I don't believe you're playing fair." "You might explain that," responded the manager curtly. "You know what the agreement was. I don't believe she'd stay away like this unless she'd been restrained." Thornburg's only response was a perplexed frown. It was Mrs. Thornburg who first took in the situation. She arose, painfully agitated, and faced Barron. "Do you mean that she isn't at your house?" she demanded. Her voice trailed away to a whisper, for already she read the answer in his eyes. Barron sank back in his chair. "She hasn't been for weeks," he replied. Thornburg sprang to his feet so energetically that the caller followed his example. "I thought it was you who wasn't playing fair," he said, and then he stared, amazed at the change in Barron's manner. The younger man was rushing from the room. There had come to him unbidden the picture of the two actors who had snubbed him in front of his house, a recollection of their studied aloofness, their cold, skillful avoidance of an encounter with him. They had taken her. But at the door he paused. "But I telephoned to you," he said, remembering. "You told me she was here." "She was here the day you telephoned. She went away the next day." Barron frowned. "She went away? Where?" "She went in the machine. Of course, we supposed—" Thornburg hurried to the telephone and was speaking to his chauffeur in a moment. "Oliver, come to the house a moment, Oliver, and hurry." He replaced the receiver and hurried back to meet the chauffeur. The soldierly-appearing young chauffeur was standing at attention before them in a moment. "We want to know if you can remember where you took Bonnie May the last time she left the house." Perfectly, sir. She asked me to stop at the Palace Theater. She said she was expecting to meet a friend there, and she told me I was not to wait, that she wouldn't need the car again that afternoon. 15 minutes later, Barron was ringing the bell of the house next to the mansion. He couldn't recall the two actors' names, but he described them. He wished to see them on urgent business. But they had paid their bill and gone away. The woman who met Barron at the door was sure they had said something about finishing their engagement at the Folly and about leaving the city. As Barron turned away from the door, it seemed to him that the street had suddenly gone empty, that the whole world was a haunted wilderness. End of section 29. Section 30 of Bonnie May by Louis Dodge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kari Burns. The Break of Day. Mr. Victor Barron, please. An usher with an absurdly severe uniform and a frankly cherubic countenance had pushed aside the hangings and stood looking into the Barron box in the Barrymore Theater. It was the night of the first performance of Baggot's play, The Break of Day, in Thornburg's Theater, and the Barrons were all present by special and urgent invitation. Barron had been studying the aisles full of people, eagerly seeking their seats and listening to the continuous murmur which arose all over the house. But when he heard his name called, he arose and slipped out into the shadows. Mr. Thornburg sends his compliments and asks if you'll be good enough to visit him in his office for a few minutes. Thus, the cherubic usher. The Barrymore office was off from the lobby, and it commanded a view not only of the street, but also of the procession of men and women who passed the ticket office. Thornburg had left the door open, and Barron, approaching, caught sight first of a considerable expanse of dazzling white shirt front, and then the manager's ruddy, smiling countenance. Evidences of prosperity were all about. A procession of motor cars continued to stop before the theater to deposit passengers. Throughout the lobby, there was the shimmer of costly fabrics worn by women, the flashing of jewels, the rising and falling of gusts of laughter, and a chaos of happy speech. And everywhere there was the glitter of onyx panels and pillars, and the warmth of hooded lights, and the indefinable odor of fine raiment and many delicate perfumes. Thornburg seized Barron's hand and shoved the door to with his foot. Happiness radiated from him. "I've a secret to tell you," he began. "I want you to be one of the first to know." "Let's have it," responded Barron, trying to reflect a little of the manager's gaiety. "You'll remember my telling you that I had a little daughter by my first wife?" "I remember." "I found her again." "Ah, that's fine." "And that isn't all. You're going to see her tonight." Barron waited. "She's the girl they've been making all that fuss about in Chicago, who's been known only as the Sprite. She's got the leading part in The Break of Day." Barron felt his way cautiously. He couldn't mar such superb complacency, such complete happiness. "And Mrs. Thornburg," he began haltingly. "God bless her. It's all right with her. She knows, and she's as happy as I am." Baron shrunk back with a sense of utter loss. "Thornburg," he said, "I want you to tell me, is the little girl the daughter of Miss Barry?" The manager clapped a heavy hand on Baron's shoulder. "No," he responded, and after a moment's almost pensive reflection, he regained his buoyant manner and resumed. "I'd like you to meet her, between acts or after the play, you and your family. She's young. I think a little attention, especially motherly attention, will mean a lot to her just now. Of course, she mustn't be worried tonight, but suppose we make up a little party after the performance and make her feel that she's got friends here." Baron couldn't think of refusing. "I'd have time to pay my respects at least," he agreed, "and I'll put the case before my mother and the others, just as you have stated it. I think perhaps she'll consent." "That's a good fellow. I'll be looking for you," concluded Thornburg, and then he joyously shoved Baron out of the office. The footlights were being turned on and the asbestos curtain lifted as Baron returned to his seat. Then the orchestra began to play, and under cover of the music, Thornburg's secret and his invitation were passed on to Mrs. Baron and to the others in the box. Baron did not catch his mother's response, and she did not repeat it. She had turned to listen to the music. For the moment, the orchestra was commanding a good deal of attention. A cycle of popular melodies was being played, and under the spell of the singing violins, the outside world was being made to recede into the distance, while the mimic world became real. Men and women forgot that out on the winter streets, only a few yards from them, there was passing that disinterested throng which always passes the door of every theater, the eager, the listless, the hopeful, the discouraged, and that sprinkling of derelicts who have no present drama at all, but who are bearing inevitably on toward the final tragedy. The orchestra completed the popular melodies, and after a brief interval, the leader rapped his music rack with his baton to enjoin attention. Then he lifted his hand as if in benediction over a player to his left, and a woodwind instrument announced a new theme, penetratingly, arrestingly. Then the strains of the Ride of the Valkyries, with their strident and compelling quality, filled the theater. Baron was startled by the touch of a hand on his shoulder. Baggot was leaning toward him. "That's to create the right atmosphere," he whispered, nodding toward the orchestra. "It's to put the idea of the supernatural into everybody's mind, you know." He withdrew then. Baron thought that was just like Baggot, to be explaining and asserting himself as if he were doing it all. He was glad to be rid of him. He wanted to feel, not to think. Then he realized that the musicians had laid aside their instruments and that the curtain was being slowly lifted. Applause greeted the setting. The stage represented the heart of a forest in midsummer, the heart of the summer storms. There was a shadowy dell, shut in by a wilderness. One giant tree in the foreground rose to invisible heights. At the back, a little stream trickled down over a mossy bank, and during its course it formed a silent pool in one silent place, and before this a Psyche innocently regarded her face in the mirror of water. Then the foliage of the big tree began to be agitated by a rising storm, and the leaves shook as if they were being beaten by descending drops. For a moment, the summer shower effect continued. Then, from the highest point on the stage, visible to the audience, a character in the drama appeared, the sprite. She sprang from some unseen point to the limb of the ancient tree. The limb gave gently, and she sprang to the next limb below. The secure platforms making this form of descent possible were hidden from the audience by heavy foliage. The descent continued until the fairy figure sprang lightly to the stage. She was clad in a costume of leaves, the prevailing color of which was a deep green, rising to natural tints of yellow. She wore a hood which was cunningly fashioned from one big leaf, around which an automobile veil of the gauziest texture was wound so that it concealed her face. She began unwinding this veil as she spoke her first lines. "Back again where the storms are," she was saying. "Ah, it is good after that dreadful calm." Baron realized that his mother had lifted her hands to her bosom as if to stifle a cry. For himself, a thrill shot through his body, and then he leaned forward, rigid, amazed. For when the sprite had removed the last fold of her veil and faced the audience, he beheld again, after long waiting and vain search, the lost guest, Bonnie May. She wore her hair in a little golden knot at the crown of her head. The waistline of her dress was just below her arms, and a pair of tiny golden sandals adorned her feet. When she would have lain the veil aside, a screen of leaves parted, and a Titan sprang to her side to render service. And so the play began. But for the moment, Baron could not think about the play. He was thinking of Baggot, who had known all the time. Then again he felt a touch on his arm and, turning, he found himself looking into the playwright's eyes, and he could perceive only the delight of a childish creature, jubilant because he had achieved an innocent surprise. He tried to respond with a smile and could not. But little by little the play caught his attention. The impression grew upon him that The Break of Day was a play of that indefinable quality which goes unfailingly to the heart. But more, he realized that Bonnie May was carrying her audience with her with the ease and certainty of an artist. She ceased to be on trial almost immediately, and those who watched her began to feel rather than to think, to accept rather than to judge. When the first intermission came, Baron slipped out of the box and went in search of Baggot, whom he found standing apart in the foyer. "I don't have to tell you I'm glad," he began, and then, with furrowed brow, he added, "But surely." Baggot read his thought accurately. "I wanted to give you the surprise of your life. You can't help being pleased." "Pleased? Certainly, but we've been distressed about her." "Oh, distressed? Well, she belongs to the theater. She always has. I saw that right away. But if we'd only known, I don't suppose we could have stood in the way." "But it was her idea, at first. She didn't want you to know. I mean, when we put the piece on here for a tryout, at first." "You don't mean—" "Of course. It was when you were laid up. I thought she'd lay down on me because you wouldn't see her that night. And then came the Chicago engagement. I took my mother along to look after her. I didn't know she hadn't told you anything for a time, and then I left it to her to do what she wanted to do. It was always her idea to take you by surprise. I think she cared more for that than for anything else. Great goodness, man, you don't imagine you've been treated badly. Baron's glance became inscrutable. Why, just think of it, Baggot went on. She's drawing the salary of a regular star, and her reputation is made. Baron turned away almost curtly. What was to be gained by discussing Bonnie May with a creature who could only think of salary and reputation, to whom she was merely a puppet, skilled in repeating lines of someone else's fashioning? He entered Thornburg's office. His manner was decidedly lugubrious. The manager held out his hand expansively. "You've come to congratulate me," he said. And then he took in Baron's mood. "Oh, I see," he went on. "There's something that needs explaining. I played fair with you all right, Baron. You see, I was in the dark myself in some ways." He took occasion to light a cigar, which he puffed at absent-mindedly. "Just before Bonnie May showed up here, when you got hold of her, I learned that her mother had died. It had been kept from me. You see, I was sending the mother money. And when the little one was only a year or so old, I got a letter from her mother offering to give her up to me. I've told you what happened then. I couldn't take her. Then I got another letter from the mother saying she was turning Bonnie May over to her sister for the time being, and that I was to send the remittances to her. That was Miss Barry. I believed the arrangement was only temporary. I didn't understand it, of course. But when several years went by, I began to suspect that something was wrong. I didn't like Miss Barry. She was never the woman her sister was. She was, well, the brazen sort of woman. I wasn't willing to leave the little daughter with her any longer. I wrote to her and told her she might send Bonnie May to me, if she cared to, but that there weren't to be any more remittances. I thought that would fetch her. I meant to put the little daughter in a home or a school somewhere. And then they blew in here, and you got her. And your getting her was just the thing I wanted." An incandescent light on the manager's desk winked once and again. "The curtain's going up," he informed Baron, and the latter hurried back to his seat. As he entered the box, a flood of cold air from the stage swept over the audience. And when his mother shivered slightly, he observed that Peter Addis, sitting immediately behind her, quietly leaned forward and lifted a quilted satin wrap from a chair, placing it deftly about her shoulders. She yielded with a nestling movement and with a backward flash of grateful recognition which told a story of their own. The audience was stilled again as the second setting was revealed, the home of the autumn leaves. Here was a masterpiece of designing and painting, Baron realized. A house was being constructed for the sprite. Much disputation arose. The sort of talk which precedes the planning of a home was heard, save that the terms were grotesquely altered. Then the action was complicated by the arrival of a band of Vikings, driven ashore by a gale. And then Baron, too, forgot that Bonnie May was a human being, as Baggot seemed to have done, and was lost in the ingenious whimsicality of the play. It was after the third act, in which there was a picture of cruel winter, with all the characters in the play combating a common foe in the form of the withering cold, that the sprite won the heartiest approval. Thunders of applause swept over the house, and when the effect of thunder had passed, there was a steady demonstration resembling the heavy fall of rain. Again and again, Bonnie May bowed as the curtain was lifted and lowered, and again, the applause took on new vigor and earnestness. And then she stepped a little forward and nodded lightly towards someone back in the wings, and the curtain remained up. She made a little speech. It seemed she had a special voice for that, too. It was lower, but elaborately distinct. The very unconventionality of it afforded a different kind of delight. Her manner was one of mild disparagement of an inartistic custom. She bowed herself from the stage with infinite graciousness. She was a tremendous success. It was only after the curtain went down for the last time that Thornburg appeared at the barren box. The scene had been called Spring and the Fairies, and it had put the pleasantest of thoughts into the minds of the audience, which was now noisily dispersing. "I hope you're all coming back on the stage for a minute," said the manager. He was dismayed by Mrs. Barron's impetuosity. She was too eager to remain an instant talking to anyone. She could scarcely wait to be escorted back to the stage, and yet she had no idea how to reach that unknown territory undirected. Her bearing was really quite pathetic. And in a moment the entire party had passed through a doorway quite close to the box, and were casting about in that region where the wings touched the dressing rooms. The players were hurrying to and fro, and one man, carrying a large waxen nose and a pair of enormous ears — he had been a gnome in the play — paused and looked curiously at the very circumspect intruders. Somehow it did not seem at all remarkable to Barron, as it might have done, that he presently found himself confronting Miss Barry. It was plain that she had been waiting to enter the child's dressing room, and at the approach of Thornburg she brightened, rather by intention, perhaps, than spontaneously. "Oh, how fortunate," she began. "You'll be able to help me, of course. I want to see the new star. I'd lost track of her." Her practiced smile and shifting eyes played upon Thornburg menacingly, inquiringly, appealingly. "I want to begin planning for her again. When her engagement here is over, I mean to take her with me to the coast. She's reached an age now when I can be of real help to her. Isn't it wonderful, the way she has developed?" Thornburg had paused to hear her to the end. He realized that there was a pitiful lack of assurance, of conviction in her manner. When she had finished, he smiled tolerantly, yet with unmistakable significance. "No, Miss Barry," he said, replying to her thought rather than her words. "That's all ended now. When Bonnie May has finished her work here, I shall see that she has a home in her father's house." The party moved into the dressing room, where Bonnie May had been robbed of her fairy trappings and put into a modest frock. Her hair, released from its little knot, was falling about her shoulders and was being combed by a maid. But she escaped from the maid, and for the moment from all the life which the dressing room implied, when she saw Mrs. Barron standing in her doorway. She had put her arms about the trembling old lady's neck, and for the moment they were both silent. And then Mrs. Barron drew back and stood a moment, her hands framing Bonnie May's face. "You do forget that I was a disagreeable old woman," she murmured. "Oh, that," came the warm response. You know, you forget just little slips when you are happy in your work. And I couldn't have remembered such a little thing anyway, when you'd been so lovely to me." She took Mrs. Barron's hand in both her own and clung to it and lifted it to her face and laid her cheek against it. "If you only knew how I've thought of you, of all of you, and longed for you, and how much I wanted you to see me at work so you would know me better. You know, just talking doesn't prove anything. I wanted so much to have you know that I was an artist." In the theater, the orchestra was still playing while the people filed out. In the distance, there was the muffled sound of the procession of motor cars starting and of announcers shouting numbers above the din. It was Flora's turn to press forward and take her seat beside Bonnie May now, and while Mrs. Barron stood aside, smiling quite happily, the manager spoke to her as if he were merely continuing a conversation which had been interrupted. "Yes, I'm particularly anxious to have you go on with the lessons, you know. Not just the books and music, you understand, but, well, say a general influence. You know, she's tremendously fond of all of you. I mean to get her off the stage as soon as the run here is finished. It's time for her to have a little real life. And I'd like things to go on about as they were. I mean, having her in your house, or mine, just as she feels about it. You were the first to give her a mother's attention. I'd be grateful if you felt you could go on with that." Mrs. Barron tried to answer this quite punctiliously, but she had to turn aside to hide her eyes, and when she spoke, her words were a surprise to her. "I think you're a good man," she said, and she did not trust herself to say anything more. She was gazing at Bonnie May again, and noticing how the strange little creature was clinging to Flora's hand with both her own and telling, with her eyes illustrating the story gloriously, of the great events which had transpired since that day when the mansion went back to its normal condition of loneliness and silence. Barron was observing her too. He had found a chair quite outside the center of the picture, and he was trying to assume the pose of a casual onlooker. But Bonnie May's eyes met his after a time, and something of the radiance passed from her face. She turned away from Flora and stood apart a little and clasped her hands up nearly beneath her chin, and her whole being seemed suddenly tremulous. She was thinking of the home that had been made for her, and of how it was Barron who had opened its door. The others had been lovely, but the ready faith and the willingness to stand the brunt, these had been his. She moved forward almost shyly until she stood before him, and then her hands went out to him. "I must offer my congratulations too," he said, but she ignored that. "Do you remember a time when we talked together about some words that we thought were beautiful up in the attic?" she asked. "And you told me you didn't think much of aunt or uncle, but that you liked father and, yes, that was the time. I remember perfectly. You know, there's another word I've thought of since then that I've wished I could have for my own." He seemed to be casting about for that other word. "It's a lovely word, too." She drew closer to him. "Help me," she pleaded, and when he looked into her eyes a bit startled, she whispered, "Brother, brother." Her hand was on his shoulder, and then it slipped its way to his neck. "Ah, that is a good word," said Barron. And then the tempest of affection broke, and she had her arms about his neck. He had no idea she was so strong. She was choking him a bit, but no, it wasn't really the strength of her arms after all, he realized. And then, because his mother and Flora were watching, and because he was barren, he straightened up and got possession of her hands again. He patted them lightly. "It is a good word," he repeated. "It's one that has come to have a much bigger meaning for me since I knew you." "And you won't think it's got anything to do with that silly old joke?" He was really perplexed. "You know, when they say, 'I'll be a sister to you.'" She was bubbling over with the old merriment now. "Just to make you keep at a distance, you know." "Oh, no, I'll be sure it hasn't anything to do with that." He regarded her almost dreamily as she turned again to his mother and Flora. He was thinking of the amazing buoyancy, of the disconcerting, almost estranging humor which lay always just beneath the surface, of her fine courage, of the ineradicable instinct which made everything a sort of play. They would be hers always. Or would there come a time when she would lose them, he wondered. "There is our number," interrupted Peter Addis, who had been listening to the voice of the announcers. He had brought the party to the theater in his own car. There was a reluctant movement toward the theater. "Oh, a matinee performance now and then, if she likes," Thornburg was explaining to Barron. "But for a few years at least, that will be all. She's going to have the thing she's had to go without all her life." They followed the line of the wall around toward the front exit. The orchestra had quit playing. The time had come to extinguish the lights. But after the others had gone, Barron stood a moment alone. He looked thoughtfully toward the upper right-hand box. "I thought she was lost that day," he mused. "I thought I was rescuing her. And now I know she wasn't really lost then, not until afterward. And now she has found her home again." End of section 30. End of Bonnie May by Lewis Dodge.